Smoke in a place like this means one of two things. Trouble, or some— I hold the deed now, so open the door and talk like decent folk. If you're planning to act foolish, make it quick. You know this pack.
I know men like Baird don't send someone who knocks first.
That makes me a better class of trouble.
He paid $1 silver for a condemned mountain cabin, and the woman inside lowered her shotgun and whispered, "You finally came." Read the story of two outcasts who held a piece of stolen land, fought a corrupt empire, and found in each other something no deed could ever title. The courthouse smelled like old cigars and wet wool, and something else underneath all of that desperation, maybe. The kind that soaks into floorboards over years. Winter had come early to Bitter Creek County, and the windows were fogged so thick you couldn't see the street outside. Just gray shapes moving through gray light like ghosts that hadn't figured out they were dead yet. It was January of 1888, and the auction had already been going 2 hours. Reuben Cross stood near the back wall, with his arms folded, watching. He was a big man, wide through the chest and shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that made up Black Ridge. His coat was trail-worn elk hide, dark with grease and weather. His boots were caked with road mud that nobody had bothered to scrape off at the door. He hadn't bothered either. He didn't look like a man with money. He wasn't supposed to. The auction clerk, a thin man named Whitfield, with a paper collar and ink-stained fingers, stood behind a pine table at the front of the room, calling out parcels. He had the voice of someone who had been told he sounded important and had believed it. Every parcel he called drew a cluster of men forward ranch hands, bidding on behalf of someone richer, speculators in good wool coats, a few genuine homesteaders with red-rimmed eyes, who looked like they hadn't slept since harvest season. Baird's men were easy to spot. There were 6 of them seated in the first 2 rows, thick-necked and patient, with a particular stillness of men who already knew how everything was going to go. Montgomery Baird himself sat at the far left end of the front row, in a chair that someone had thoughtfully brought in from the hotel next door, high-backed, padded with dark red velvet, slightly ridiculous in a courthouse full of splintered benches. Baird was in his early 60s, built lean and precise like a well-maintained weapon. His mustache was waxed. His coat was black cashmere with a fur collar. His boots reflected the light from the oil lamp overhead, and his hands rested on the silver head of a walking stick. He didn't actually need to walk. He used it instead as a prop, as a reminder of what he was. He hadn't spoken once in 2 hours. He didn't need to. Every parcel that mattered was going to his men, and everyone in the room understood that, and understanding it was easier than fighting it. Reuben watched all of this and felt nothing he hadn't felt before. He'd been in rooms like this one. Not courthouses exactly, but places where the machinery of ownership ground forward regardless of who got caught underneath it. He'd seen the faces of the men who worked that machinery and the faces of the men who got processed by it. And he knew which face he was looking at when he looked at Baird. "Parcel 47, Whitfield called out, shuffling his papers with an air of theatrical fatigue. "Black Ridge Upper Claim, 212 acres, timber and rock, east slope. Assessed value $16, tax arrearage of $9.40. Minimum opening bid $1. There was a moment of silence, and then quietly, a few people in the room laughed. Not loud, not cruel. Just the small, helpless laughter of men who know a joke when they hear one. Black Ridge, even Reuben had heard about Black Ridge before he'd ever set foot in Bitter Creek. Every town in mountain country had a piece of land like it, a place that had eaten enough men that the land itself had developed a reputation. 2 miners had gone up there in '84, chasing a silver rumor, and come back down in the spring as frozen stiff as fence posts. A homesteader named Garrett had tried to run cattle on the east slope in '86 and lost the whole herd to a rock slide inside of a month. The claim had changed hands 3 times in 6 years, through death and abandonment, and now it was here, at the bottom of a tax auction, And Whitfield was already reaching for the next sheet of paper because nobody was going to bid on Black Ridge. $1. Reuben said it clearly enough to be heard across the room, without raising his voice. Every head turned, Whitfield looked up from his papers. He blinked twice, which seemed to be his way of processing surprise. I'm sorry, sir, did you say? $1. Reuben unfolded his arms and moved forward through the crowd, which parted for him, the way crowds for large men, moving with clear purpose. He reached the table and set the coin down. A Morgan silver dollar, worn smooth on the eagle side, dull as old bone. It made a flat, heavy sound on the pine. Whitfield stared at it. He looked up at Reuben. He looked back at the coin. Sir, you understand this is Black Ridge Upper Claim. 200 and? I can read the sheet, Reuben said. Is the bid accepted? Whitfield cleared his throat. He looked toward the front row out of habit, the way a man looks toward the person he actually works for. Baird hadn't moved. He was watching Reuben with the composed, measuring attention of someone who has just noticed a new piece on the board and is deciding whether it's worth the effort of removing. Is there a second bid? Whitfield asked the room. Nothing. The speculators weren't interested. Baird's men hadn't been told to bid on Black Ridge because Black Ridge wasn't worth bidding on. Nobody sane was going to outbid $1 for a stretch of cursed granite on the worst ridge in the county. Going once, Whitfield said, with the thin formality of a man completing a transaction he doesn't quite understand. Going twice. He paused. He looked at Baird again, almost helplessly. Baird said nothing. Sold. Black Ridge Upper Claim. 212 acres. $1. Reuben picked up the deed receipt that Whitfield produced from beneath the table already filled out, because the county prepared them in advance and folded it into the inside breast pocket of his coat. He didn't smile. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He turned to go. Just a moment. Baird's voice was quiet and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. He rose from the velvet chair with the unhurried grace of someone who has decided to be amused rather than threatened. You've just spent a silver dollar on the worst piece of ground in Bitter Creek County, Baird said. He walked forward slowly, the silver-headed stick tapping the floorboards in a measured rhythm. His men had all turned to watch. Half the room had turned to watch. The previous 3 owners died or fled inside a season. The 4th walked off that ridge in the middle of winter and hasn't been seen since. Whatever made you think that was a wise investment? Reuben looked at him. He took his time about it, the way a man takes his time when he doesn't feel any particular rush because the other man's opinion isn't something he needs to get to quickly. The previous owners made mistakes, Reuben said. That's their business, not mine. Baird smiled, thin and practiced. You're a scout, if I'm reading that pack correctly. Former cavalry, I'd guess. Am I close? Close enough. Then you're a practical man. Baird stopped about 4 feet away, close enough for a conversation, far enough to be making a statement about the distance he kept from men like Reuben. So let me be practical with you. That ridge is worthless rock and bad timber. You'll freeze up there inside of 2 months. Come spring, the county will auction that deed again, and my people will take it for whatever the back taxes have accumulated to. You'll have spent $1 and a winter of your life for nothing. That's one way it could go, Reuben said. Baird's smile stayed exactly where it was. You'd be better served spending that $1 on a train ticket south. The room was quiet enough that you could hear the coal popping in the potbelly stove in the corner. Whitfield was pretending to sort his papers. The homesteaders near the back had the careful, collective stillness of men who are listening hard but don't want to be noticed doing it. Reuben looked at Baird for another moment. Then he said it, slow and level, not raising his voice any more than Baird had raised his. A man can buy dirt for $1, Mr. Baird, but human dignity don't come with a price tag on your auction block. Something moved behind Baird's eyes. Not rage, he was too controlled for rage. Something colder than that. Something calculating. He looked at Reuben the way a man looks at a lock. he hasn't yet found the right key for, and he filed that look away somewhere. And then the thin smile came back. "Enjoy your mountain," Baird said pleasantly. He turned and walked back to his velvet chair. Reuben Cross walked out of the courthouse into the January cold. The town of Bitter Creek was not a beautiful place, and it had stopped trying to be one sometime around 1879 when the railroad spur came through and the timber operations expanded, and the money started moving so fast through so few hands that nobody who controlled it had any reason to spend it here. The main street was churned mud, frozen now into ruts that could snap a horse's ankle if you weren't careful. The buildings ran along both sides: a dry goods store, two saloons, a land office, a livery stable, a hotel that called itself the Grand Imperial, and was neither: a hardware store with a broken front window that had been patched with burlap for going on 3 winters. Reuben collected his horse from the hitching post outside a raw-boned blue roan gelding named nothing in particular, because Reuben had never seen much point in naming horses, and tied the new deed receipt into his saddlebag. He stood for a moment checking the pack straps, making small adjustments out of habit, the muscle memory of a man who had spent years in territory where a loose strap could kill you. He was aware, without looking, that 2 of Baird's men had come out of the courthouse behind him and were watching from the boardwalk. He didn't look. He pulled on his heavy gauntlet gloves, gathered the reins, and stepped into the saddle in one smooth motion that said he'd done it 10,000 times. He had. The ride north out of Bitter Creek took him through timber country that had been logged hard and was beginning to show its stumps everywhere. Slash piles rotting under the snow, the raw, scarred look of land that has been taken rather than used. Above the logging line, the real timber started, old growth that hadn't yet been worth the effort, and above that, the rock faces of the ridge country, gray and white and indifferent, the kind of country that doesn't care what you think of it. He rode for 3 hours. The temperature dropped steadily as he climbed. By the time he reached the upper Elk Meadows below Black Ridge, the sky had turned the flat, pale color that meant weather coming, serious weather, not a flurry but a real storm, the kind the mountains manufacture in January when they decide they've been hospitable long enough. He'd been watching that sky since Bitter Creek. He pushed the roan a little harder. The cabin was on a sheltered bench below the main ridge face, which was the first smart thing whoever had originally built it had done, tucked in against a granite outcropping on the north side, so the worst of the wind would break before it got there. South-facing to catch what winter sun existed, within 100 yards of a spring-fed creek that ran too fast to freeze solid even in hard cold. Somebody who knew mountain country had picked this spot. He found the track that led to it by reading the terrain rather than looking for the path, because the path was buried under a foot of snow. The roan picked its way through carefully, snorting clouds of steam, its unshod hooves finding purchase on the frozen ground underneath. He was still a quarter-mile out when he saw the smoke. It was faint, just a thread rising from the stone chimney, pale gray against the pale gray sky, but it was there. Reuben pulled up the roan and sat looking at it for a long moment, absolutely still, his breath fogging in the cold. Somebody was in that cabin. He thought about that with the particular, unhurried patience that had kept him alive through 10 years of frontier service. He wasn't a reckless man. He had never confused boldness with recklessness, which was an important distinction in the kind of country he'd moved through. A reckless man saw a situation and reacted to it. A careful man saw a situation, read it, and then decided what to do. And those were not the same thing. The smoke was too thin for a large fire. One person, maybe 2, burning what wood was available, and burning it conservatively. The thread didn't waver much, which meant whoever was tending it knew what they were doing: a small, hot fire, rather than a smoky, lazy one. That wasn't the fire of someone panicking, or someone just arrived. That was someone who'd been there a while and was managing resources. Trespasser was one possibility. Squatter, The other possibility was something he couldn't fully account for yet, because he didn't know enough about what had happened on this land before the tax auction and the dead man's claim and the 4 owners who had fled or frozen. He nudged the roan forward, slower now. He kept to the tree line where he could, approaching from the northeast side, angling toward the cabin in a way that kept the granite outcropping between him and the door as long as possible. Old habit, good habit. The cabin resolved itself out of the snow and the failing light as he got closer. It was in rough shape. One side of the porch roof had partially collapsed under snow load, and the front door hung slightly crooked in its frame, which meant the timber had settled or the foundation had shifted, possibly both. The chinking between the logs had failed in places, stuffed with what looked like rags and pine boughs to keep the wind out. One of the shuttered windows had a piece of oilskin nailed over it where the shutter had broken off. But the chimney was solid stone, well laid, and the smoke coming from it was real. He tied the roan to a pine 50 feet out, where the horse was sheltered and wouldn't announce itself by stamping or nickering, and he covered the last distance on foot, moving through the snow with a careful, weight-distributed walk of a man who knows how to cover ground quietly. He stopped at the corner of the cabin, listened, wind, distant, and building. The creak of the damaged porch roof under its load of snow, his own pulse, steady, nothing else. He stepped around to the front and put 3 knocks on the door, deliberate, evenly spaced, the kind of knock that says, "I'm not hiding the fact that I'm here," and then stepped back and to the side out of reflex, because standing directly in front of a closed door is a habit. Only a man who's never been shot at maintains for long. Silence from inside. He waited, counted a slow 5, and knocked again. "I've got the deed to this claim," he said to the door. "County auction today. I'm not here to throw anyone into the cold. Just want to talk." More silence. Longer this time. Then the scrape of something, a bar being lifted maybe, or a heavy piece of furniture being moved. The door opened inward about 6 inches, stopped by the warped frame, and then was forced open another few inches by a shoulder on the other side. The barrel of a shotgun came through the gap first. 12 gauge by the look of it, a side-by-side with both hammers drawn back, and it was pointed at approximately the center of his chest, with the steadiness of someone who had done this before and wasn't performing. Behind the gun, in the gap of the door, was a woman. She was young, somewhere in her mid-20s maybe, though it was hard to say because she was thin in the way that speaks to hard months, rather than nature cheekbones prominent, eyes large and dark and fever-bright, her dark hair loose and tangled where it fell across one shoulder. She had the coloring and the bone structure that told a story of mixed blood, French and native, and she wore it in the particular way of someone who has been told all her life that it is something to be ashamed of, and has decided somewhere along the way that that is everyone else's problem. Her hands were wrapped around the shotgun's grip and forestock, and they were shaking, but not from fear. The shaking was something else, the fever maybe, or exhaustion, or both. Her eyes moved over him fast and sharp, taking inventory. The elk-hide coat, the trail pack, the scout's gear. Her gaze stopped for a moment on the pack, and something moved in her face, not recognition exactly, but the landing of something she had been waiting for. The shotgun barrels dipped, not all the way, but enough to mean something. She stood there looking at him, and the fever-bright eyes had something in them now that he couldn't immediately name, not relief, too complicated for that, not hope, too raw and guarded, something that had been held closed for a long time, and was considering very cautiously the possibility of opening. She said nothing for a long moment. Her hands were still shaking. A bead of sweat ran down her temple despite the cold. Then she turned and took one step back into the cabin, and her legs went wrong under her. She caught herself on the doorframe with one hand, the shotgun dropping to her side, and she stayed there for a moment, with her eyes closed and her forehead against the rough timber, breathing. When she opened her eyes, they were still sharp, still present, but the body underneath them was done, pretending it had anything left. She let herself slide down to sit with her back against the inside wall of the doorframe, the shotgun across her knees, looking up at him from the floor of the cabin. She had clearly not left in longer than was good for her. She said it just above a whisper, exhausted, certain, like a woman crossing off the last line on a very long list. You finally came. Reuben stood in the doorway of the purchased cabin, on a dead man's claim at the edge of a January blizzard, and looked at the woman on the floor. And he felt the full weight of a situation he didn't yet have the shape of, but understood was significant. She wasn't a squatter who'd wandered in out of the cold. The way she'd held that shotgun, the way she'd looked at his pack, the way she'd said those 3 words, all of it said she'd been here, waiting, with specific knowledge of something he was only beginning to understand. He stepped inside. He pulled the warped door shut behind him, as best it would go, and dropped the locking bar across it himself. The cabin's interior was small, one with a stone fireplace on the east wall where a modest fire burned controlled, careful, like he'd read from the smoke, and a rope-strung bunk along the south wall, and a rough table, and 2 chairs, and not much else. The floor was dirt hardened to near concrete with age and use. It smelled like wood smoke and cold, and something sharper underneath, the smell of a body fighting an infection it is slowly losing. He crouched down beside her. Up close, the fever was obvious, the heat coming off her skin. The way her eyes couldn't quite stay focused, the slight tremor that had moved from her hands into her whole frame. "You been alone up here?" he asked. She nodded once, chin dropping. How long, she thought about it. 3 weeks. A pause. Maybe 4. 3 or 4 weeks alone, on a mountain in January, with a fever and whatever had happened to her wrists. He could see the bruising now, dark against her skin, the particular marks that come from rope or iron rather than accident. He looked at the fire. He looked at the small, carefully rationed stack of wood against the wall. He looked at the woman on the floor, who had held a 12 gauge on him with shaking hands, and then used the last of her strength to say 3 words. He stood up and went back out into the cold. The roan needed to be unsaddled and sheltered, and the storm was maybe 2 hours out by the look of that sky, and there was a significant amount of work to do before dark. He understood all of that. He also understood, with the quiet, practical certainty of a man who doesn't spend a lot of time arguing with what's in front of him, that he had not bought 212 acres of Black Ridge mountain claim today. He had walked through a door. He went to get his gear. The storm hit just before dark. It didn't come in gradually the way some storms do, building politely from the west and giving you time to think. This one rolled over the ridge like a wall wind first, hard enough to lean into, then snow so thick and sideways that the tree line disappeared inside of 30 seconds. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took Reuben to get the roan unsaddled and into the lean-to shelter on the south side of the cabin. He worked fast, no wasted motion, pulled the saddle and blanket, rubbed the horse down with a handful of dry straw he found under the lean-to overhang, checked the animal's feet for ice pack, tied him short so he couldn't spook and pull loose in the wind. He dragged his 2 trail packs inside and made a second trip for the saddlebags. By the time he shouldered back through the cabin door, his coat was white and his beard had ice crystals in it, and he couldn't feel the last 2 fingers on his left hand. He dropped the bar across the door. The woman was still on the floor where he'd left her, but she'd moved. She'd gotten herself from the doorway to the wall beside the fireplace, a distance of maybe 8 feet, and the effort had clearly cost her. She was sitting with her back against the stone, legs stretched out, the shotgun still across her knees. Her eyes were open, tracking him as he came in and shed his coat and hung it on the peg beside the door. She hadn't put the gun down. He respected that. He didn't say anything about it. He went to the fire first, because the fire was the most important thing in the room. It was burning low. She'd been conserving wood, feeding it just enough to keep it alive, and the cabin was cold enough that his breath still showed. He added 2 split logs from the stack, placed them the right way so they'd catch and burn clean, then put a third one across on top at an angle. He felt her watching him while he did it. "There's water?" he asked, not turning around. "Creek." Her voice was hoarser than before. "South side of the cabin. You'll need to break the skin ice. I've been using the pot." He looked at the iron pot sitting on the hearthstone beside the fire. Some water left in it, maybe a quart. He picked it up, felt the temperature, set it back closer to the heat. He turned and looked at her properly, for the first time since he'd come back inside. The firelight was better now, with the new logs catching, and he could see more than he'd seen in the door gap. The bruising on her wrists was worse than he'd first thought, both of them, dark and deep, wrapping all the way around. There was a cut on her lower lip that had healed badly, and a yellowish bruise along her left cheekbone that was old enough to be fading, but had been significant when it was fresh. Her clothes were layered, everything she owned probably, because the cabin had been too cold to manage otherwise. A wool skirt over what looked like a man's canvas trousers, 2 shirts and a vest, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and tucked under her arms. She watched him looking and didn't flinch from it. Her chin stayed level. Whatever she'd expected to see on his face, disgust, pity, the particular cruelty of a man who knows he has the advantage and intends to use it, she was ready to answer it. She'd been answering things like that her whole life. He looked away first, not in discomfort, just because he'd seen what he needed to see, and staring past that point was its own kind of rudeness. "I've got dried elk and hardtack in the pack," he said, "and willow bark if you want to get that fever down." A pause. "The willow bark first," she said. "That's what I'd do too." He went to the larger pack and started working through it methodically. The woman on the floor watched without speaking. Outside, the wind was building into something serious, a full-throated howl that found every gap in the cabin walls and pushed through it, and the rag and pine bough chinking wasn't quite up to the job. Drafts moved along the floor. The fire pulled and flickered. He found the willow bark wrapped in a cloth square and held it up so she could see it. She nodded. He set the water pot to heat properly on the flat stone at the fire's edge. "Reuben Cross," he said. "Former 3rd Cavalry, 9th Regiment, out of Fort Halleck." She was quiet for a moment. "Tessa." "Mercier. Mercier." He turned that over, French name. Her father, likely she had her mother's coloring, the dark hair and eyes of the Métis. Any relation to the surveyor who held this claim original? She looked at him steadily. "My father." He nodded. Like that answered something, and went back to the pack. "He's dead," she said, not asking him to react to it, just stating the fact so it was in the room and didn't need to be handled later. "I'm sorry for it. He's been gone 8 months. Another pause. "He told me someone would come." Someone he'd written to. He described the pack. Her eyes moved to the trail pack. "That pack." Reuben went still for just a moment. Then he continued unpacking. "Your father contacted me through a former commanding officer. Letter reached me in September, in Wyoming. Said there was a claim here that needed someone who knew how to hold ground." He glanced at her. Said there were papers worth holding ground. Something shifted in her face, just slightly, the held-back edge of it. "He didn't tell me who, just that someone would come if something happened to him." The fire popped. The wind hit the cabin hard enough to shutter the door in its frame. Reuben got to his feet and went to the door, checked the bar, pushed his shoulder against it to feel whether the hinges were solid. They were, mostly. He pulled a spare leather strap from his coat pocket and lashed the bar down to the iron ring on the door's face for good measure. When he turned back, she was watching him with the fever-bright eyes, and there was something in them he hadn't seen before. Still guarded, but underneath that, the very specific exhaustion of someone who has been alone with a secret and a rifle for 4 weeks in a January mountain cabin, and has just now, possibly, found the one person in the world they were supposed to hand that weight to. "The water's hot enough," he said. He made the willow bark tea in the pot. Strong, let it steep. The right amount of time. He poured it into the single tin cup he found on the table and carried it over to where she sat. He stopped about 3 feet away and crouched down so he wasn't standing over her. He held the cup out. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. The shotgun was still across her knees. Though the hammers were down now, he'd noticed that without marking it aloud. She took the cup with both hands, the bruised wrists showing as the blanket fell back, and she drank. Slow, controlled sips. She kept her eyes on him while she drank. "You could have had me in the doorway," he said. "Both barrels loaded and hammers back. You had a clear shot. I know. What changed your mind?" She finished half the cup before she answered. "The pack," she said. "And the way you knocked." She looked at the door. Baird's men don't knock. He sat down on the floor across from her, back against the opposite wall, and stretched his legs out. The fire was doing its work now, the room warming in slow degrees. He pulled his rifle from where he'd leaned it against the wall and set it across his own legs, a parallel to the shotgun across hers, just so they were even in the room. Baird's men did that. He nodded at her wrists. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the bruising like she was considering how much of the story she wanted to give a man she'd known for 30 minutes. "They came 6 weeks ago," she finally said. "4 of them, a deputy and 3 hired men. They said the claim was foreclosed, tax defaulted, and I had to vacate." She paused. "When I told them I had the original federal survey documents and my father's receipts proving the boundary lines, the deputy said that was very interesting and took hold of my arms." Reuben said nothing. His jaw tightened once and then was still. "I got away," Tessa said. "One of the hired men hit his horse on the way out, and the animal reared, and I ran for the shaft." She looked at her wrists again. "I've been here since. The fever started 10 days ago. I've been fighting it." "You've been winning," he said. "It would have killed you already if you weren't." She looked at him with a skepticism that was not quite appreciation and not quite dismissal. It was the look of a woman who has heard men try to say the right thing before and has developed a finely calibrated sense for distinguishing the genuine from the practiced. Whatever she concluded about him, she went back to the tea. He got up, went to the pack, started pulling out what he'd need. Dried elk meat, hardtack, a small cloth sack of dried apples going soft but still good. He found the piece of oilcloth he kept food wrapped in and laid everything out on the table in a simple inventory. He cut 2 portions of the elk with his belt knife generous ones and put them in the pot with the remaining water to soften and warm. He worked without talking, which seemed to be acceptable to her. She watched him, which was acceptable to him. A man moving around a small space, without nervousness, without rushing, without making any sudden moves that communicates things that words don't. After a while, she said, "There's a loose board in the hearth." He looked at the hearthstone. "Under the left side," she said. "My father's documents, his ledgers, everything." She paused. "He told me not to move them. He said whoever came would know what they meant, and you've been sleeping 10 feet from them for 4 weeks. 3 weeks," she said. "Maybe 4. There was a dryness in that correction that was very nearly humor. He didn't smile, but he noted it. He went back to tending the food. The storm was full on now. No question of weather, no question of staying there, was nowhere to go, and nothing to do about it. The wind hit the roof in gusts that made the whole structure flex, and the snow was coming hard enough that it was building up against the oilskin window and muffling the light from what was left of the evening. By full dark, it would be a true whiteout up here on the ridge. He served the elk and hardtack. When it was ready, filling the tin cup for himself and finding an old clay bowl on the shelf above the fireplace for her. She sat up straighter to eat, the blanket rearranged across her shoulders, the shotgun set aside, not put away, just moved to within arm's reach against the wall. He didn't comment on that either. They ate. The fire was warm. Outside, the blizzard was doing everything it intended to do, and neither of them had any obligations to it. "The auction was today," Reuben said. after a while. I heard you when you spoke through the door. Then you know Baird's lost his claim on the land. Whatever his tax foreclosure was built on, it's been superseded. I've got the county deed. She looked at him from above the clay bowl. Baird doesn't care what he loses. In a courthouse, she said. He cares what he loses, in fact. She paused. The documents in the hearth prove his boundary lines are fraudulent. His entire timber operation on the eastern slope, 3 years of it, is on land that never legally belonged to him. The Federal Survey put the line 60 feet west of where Baird's been running it. She set the bowl down. That's not a civil dispute. That's criminal fraud. And he knows that I know, and he knows those documents exist. Which is why the deputy came. Reuben was quiet, looking at the fire. The logs had settled into a steady burn, good red-orange coals building at the base. Heat pushing out into the room in waves. How'd your father get the receipts? He asked. Proof of the bribery. He was the surveyor, she said simply. He surveyed that land for the federal government in 1881. When Baird's people came to him afterward and told him to adjust his recorded lines, he refused. They offered him money. He refused that, too. Her voice was level, telling a story she'd told herself many times in the dark. They found other ways to pressure him. Eventually, he started keeping records of every conversation, every bribe offer, every threat. He kept them because he said if something happened to him, there needed to be evidence that meant something. He was right. He paid for being right, she said. He died in August, the doctors said. It was his heart. She looked at Reuben steadily. He was 51 years old, and he was healthy, and his heart was fine in June. The fire popped. Reuben looked at her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that she didn't already know. After another moment, she looked away. The wind hit the cabin again, the hardest gust yet, and the door rattled in its frame, and the rag chinking above the window let in a thin ribbon of snow that curled in the draft and dissolved in the warm air before it reached the floor. The fire pulled sideways, recovered. Tessa had been fighting the fever all through the meal, eating with careful, deliberate bites, keeping herself upright by force of will. He could see her working at it. The heat of the room, which was finally real heat now, and not just survival heat, was making it harder rather than easier, the warmth pulling at the body's defenses, asking them to stand down. She wasn't going to make it much longer tonight. He got up and went to his pack. He unrolled the heavy buffalo robe he'd carried, strapped to the outside of the pack. Since Montana, the thing weighed 12 pounds, and was the single most unglamorous piece of gear he owned. And he shook it out and carried it to where she sat by the fire. She looked at it. She looked at him. Floor's warmer near the hearth, he said. You'll sleep better than against the wall. A pause. The fever in her eyes. The wariness underneath it. I've been sleeping against the wall, she said, in case someone got through the door. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his pack and came back with his bedroll and spread it out on the floor between her and the door, a deliberate placement, not accidental. He set his rifle on the floor beside it within easy reach. She watched him do all of this. You'll sleep by the fire, he said. I'll sleep here. Anything comes through that door. It comes through me first. She was quiet for a long time. The wind outside was a sustained howl now, that particular pitch that means the storm has committed. Nothing was moving on that mountain tonight. Nothing could. I don't know you, she finally said. No, he agreed. You could be working for Baird. If I was working for Baird, he said, sitting down on his bedroll with his back against the wall, beside the door, the conversation would have gone differently. She considered that. Her eyes were heavier than they'd been an hour ago, the fever and the warmth and the first real food she'd had in days, all pulling her toward sleep, whether she invited it or not. My father described you as a man of his word, she said. I try to be. He said you'd understand why the documents matter. Not just legally, what they mean. She paused. For people who've had things taken. Reuben looked at the fire. Something moved in his face, not visibly, Nothing a stranger would see, but something real. I understand that, he said. Yeah? She looked at him one more time, with the dark, fever-bright eyes that had been managing and calculating and surviving for 4 weeks alone on a mountain, and then she lay down on the buffalo robe near the fire and pulled it around herself, and she was asleep in less than 3 minutes. He sat by the door with his rifle and listened to the storm. It was a bad one. He'd been in worse, but not many. The wind was stripping the loose snow off the roof and throwing it in curtains, and occasionally a heavier gust would hit the cabin broadside, and the whole structure would moan, deep and low, the sound of old timber taking a load it was designed to take, but didn't enjoy. The fire held. He fed it carefully every 40 minutes or so, keeping it steady, keeping the room warm without burning through wood he'd need to make last. Tessa slept hard. Not peacefully, the fever moved through her sleep, pulling at her, and twice she shuddered under the buffalo robe without waking. Her breathing was rough at the edges, but she slept, which was what her body needed, more than anything he could give it. He sat with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees and kept watch on the barred door. And he thought about what she'd said, about her father, about documents in a hearthstone, about a federal survey line 60 feet from where a man had built a timber empire. He thought about the 3rd Cavalry, 9th Regiment. He thought about a cold morning in 1883 and a set of orders in a line he'd ridden along without questioning, because soldiers follow the lines they're given and don't ask who drew them or why. He hadn't known then. He understood that. But not knowing doesn't put anything back where it was. Outside, the blizzard pushed and howled and threw itself against Black Ridge like it had a personal grievance, and inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and the woman with the fever slept. And Reuben Cross sat at the door with his rifle and watched the dark and started, very quietly, to understand the shape of what he'd bought for a silver dollar. It was bigger than 212 acres. It was bigger than a dead man's claim. He reached into his breast pocket and touched the county deed receipt, felt the fold of the paper, and left it there. He wasn't going anywhere. The storm lasted 2 days. Not 2 days of building and easing, the way some storms have the decency to behave. 2 full days of sustained, committed, unrelenting weather that buried the lean-to to the eaves and packed snow against the cabin door until the door wouldn't open inward at all, and Reuben had to clear it from the outside, which meant going out through the window on the south wall twice a day to shovel a path. He didn't complain about this. There was nobody to complain to, and complaining about weather was the same as complaining about the color of the sky, a waste of good breath. Tessa Tedder burned with fever through the first night and into most of the next day. Not the kind of fever that kills cleanly and fast, but the grinding, exhausting kind that takes up residence and makes itself at home. She woke periodically, drank water or willow bark tea when he put it in front of her, answered questions with yes or no, and sometimes a few words more, and went back to sleep. In the worst of it, she shook hard enough under the buffalo robe that he could hear her teeth knock together. He built the fire hotter, fed it more generously, and moved his bedroll to within a few feet of hers so the heat would reach her better. He slept in short pieces, an hour or 2 at a time, listening to her breathing and listening to the storm and keeping the fire alive. By the morning of the 2nd day, the fever broke. He knew it before she woke up. The quality of her sleep changed from that dense, pulled under quality of a body fighting something to something slower and more ordinary. Her breathing evened out. The shivering stopped. He watched the sweat come up on her forehead and neck, which is the body's way of announcing it has won, and he got a clean cloth from his pack and laid it across her forehead without waking her, and then he went back to his position by the door and let her sleep. She slept through the rest of that morning. When she woke, it was early afternoon, the storm still going outside, but marginally quieter. The worst of it passed, even if the snow wasn't done. She sat up slowly, the buffalo robe falling to her waist, and she looked at the room with the clear, present eyes of someone who has come back from somewhere and is taking inventory of where they've returned to. Reuben was at the table with a piece of elk leather. He was working into a repair patch for one of his boot soles, turning the leather in his hands and cutting it with small, precise strokes of his belt knife. He looked up when she sat up. He put the knife down. "Fever's gone," he said. She put a hand to her own forehead, her temple, the back of her neck. "Yes," she said. Her voice was rough but real. "There's tea. Water's still warm." He poured it for her and brought it over. She took it and drank slowly, and he could see her doing a quiet physical assessment, taking stock of what worked, what ached, what the 2 days of burning had cost her. She was thinner than when she'd first opened the door. Pallor, and that was saying something given how depleted she'd already been. But her hands were steady on the cup. He went back to the boot, leather, and left her to wake up in her own time. She drank the tea and then spent a few minutes sitting quietly watching the fire before she said anything. "You kept it going." "Fire, yes, the whole time. That's what fires need," he said. "Somebody to keep them going." She looked at him. He was focused on the leather, not at her. She looked at her wrists, the bruising that had moved from deep purple into the mottled yellow-green of healing. She moved her fingers, closed them into loose fists, opened them again. "You looked at my wrists last night," she said. "When I was sick." "I did, Aunt." He glanced up, "and I wanted to make sure the circulation wasn't cut." "It wasn't." He paused. "The bruising will heal. The deeper tissue around the left one has some damage. You'll want to keep it warm and move the joint gently." "You've done field medicine some," he said. "Enough." She nodded and pulled the blanket up around her shoulders. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm now, warmer than it had probably been all winter under her solo management of the wood supply. She looked at the stack of firewood against the wall, which was lower than it had been 2 days ago, significantly lower. "We're going to need more wood," she said. "Storm passes, I'll put up more. There's a deadfall stand about a quarter-mile northeast. I spotted on the way in good dry timber." "I know it," she said. "My father used to harvest from it." She said that without visible grief, just information, but it sat in the room for a moment afterward, the way those kinds of statements do. He asked her, carefully, in the tone of someone who wants information, and not to cause pain, "Your father, did he have any other contacts besides me? Anyone in the county who knew about the documents?" She shook her head. He was careful. He didn't trust easily. A pause. "He trusted me, and he trusted the letter he sent you. And he trusted that the evidence would speak for itself in front of the right judge." She looked at the hearthstone on the left side of the fireplace. "He said federal jurisdiction was the only safe venue, that any county Judge Baird hadn't already purchased. He was right about that." "Yes," she said. "He was right about most things. It was a difficult way to grow up." That last sentence came out dry, slightly unexpected, and Reuben looked at her and saw the ghost of something wry in her expression. And he looked back at the boot leather so as not to make a thing of it. The afternoon wore on. The storm throttled down from a howl to a push, and the snow falling outside the oilskin window went from a horizontal blur to a straight heavy curtain. Progress. He made food the dried elk again, the last of the hardtack, the dried apples stewed in a little water with some of the bark sugar he kept in a small tin. Plain food, fuel food, nothing interesting about it, but she ate everything he put in front of her and went back for the rest of the stewed apples when he offered. He liked that about her. She wasn't going to pretend she wasn't hungry. He cleared the pot and the bowl and the tin cup and went to the window to check the snow depth. The oilskin was bowed inward with the weight of it. He pressed it back with his palm, broke the ice that had formed at the edges, looked at what light remained outside. When he turned back, she was watching him, with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. It wasn't the fever-bright wariness of the first night, or the careful measuring look of someone deciding how much to say. It was something more direct than that, more tired. "Why are you doing this?" she said. He looked at her. "Sleeping by the door?" "All of it." She gestured at the room. At him. At the situation. You bought $1 worth of mountain. You could have opened that door, seen a sick woman with a gun, and gone back to Bitter Creek and told the county there was a squatter on your claim. That's legal. That's easy. Instead, you're sleeping on the floor and making tea in the middle of the night and patching your boots like you've decided to stay a while. She kept her eyes on him. Men don't generally do things like this for nothing. Some do, he said. I haven't met them. He set the pot back on the hearthstone and sat down in one of the rough chairs at the table, forearms on his knees, looking at her directly. Your father's letter explained the situation. The documents, what they mean, what Baird is doing. He asked me to come and hold the claim. He paused. I'm holding it, that's why you came, she said. I'm asking why you're staying, why you're doing it like this. She looked at his bedroll, positioned between her and the door. You could lock me in the lean-to with the horse and be perfectly safe. I could, he agreed. So why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was direct, without decoration. Because that's not what a decent man does. She looked at him. You're sick and you're hurt, and you've been alone on a mountain for a month defending something that matters, he said. Putting you in the lean-to with the horse is the same as what Baird's deputy did. Different rope, same idea. He met her eyes. I didn't come up here to be another version of the thing that's been hurting you. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pushed at the eaves and moved on. The cabin held. She was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire. He let her be quiet. He went back to the boot leather. Then she said, My mother was Cree. Did you gather that? Yes. Her family was from the Northern Territory. She came south with my father when she married him, which his family didn't approve of, and her family didn't entirely approve of either. Because that's how it goes when people love who they love across lines that other people have decided matter. She paused. She died when I was 11. After that, it was just my father and me on survey jobs through Montana and Wyoming, and eventually here. She looked at her hands. I've been a half-breed stray for as long as I can remember. The phrase landed in the room like something dropped. Deliberately. She was watching to see what he did with it, whether he'd flinch from it, correct it with something polished, or go awkward and careful the way people do when they're more concerned with their own discomfort than with the person in front of them. He got up from the table without hurry. He took the heavy buffalo robe from the foot of her bedding, shook it out, and settled it across her shoulders. It swallowed her. She was small inside it, though nothing else about her was small. He spoke clearly, without any performance in it. The blizzard outside don't care about bloodlines, and neither do I. He tucked the edge of the robe so it would stay. Under this roof, you're a human being who needs warmth. She looked up at him. Close range now, his face directly above hers, and what she saw there was what she'd been looking for since she'd opened the door with the 12-gauge. Nothing complicated. Nothing that needed unpacking. He meant it exactly the way he'd said it. He went back to his chair. She sat inside the buffalo robe and looked at the fire and didn't say anything for a long while. The set of her jaw had changed. Not soft, she wasn't a person who went soft, but something in it had released. Like a fist that opens, not because it's defeated, but because it's decided it can. You haven't asked about the documents yet, she said. Not really. You know they're there. You know what my father said. They prove. You haven't asked to see them. When you're ready to show me, I'll look at them, he said. They'll keep another day. Most men would have been under that hearthstone the minute I told them. Most men aren't sleeping on the floor. She looked at him. He was focused on the boot leather again, making small, unhurried cuts, completely composed. She laughed. It came out short and slightly rusty from disuse, and she put a hand over her mouth after it came out, as if she'd surprised herself with it. He looked up at the sound, and for just a moment the hard set of his face eased. Then they were both looking elsewhere again, and the moment passed, and outside the snow kept coming. By the third morning, the storm was finished. It left behind a world that was perfectly, almost violently, white. The sky was cloudless and blue. the deep cobalt blue you only get at high elevation after a storm has scoured everything clean. The snow lay 4 feet deep across the meadow and deeper in the lee of the cabin and the timber, and the quality of silence that followed was total. No wind, no creak, just the muffled, muted quiet of a mountain that has pulled a heavy blanket over itself and gone still. Reuben broke out through the window. First, the door had 2 feet of packed drift against it, and spent an hour shoveling a working path to the door, to the lean-to, to the creek. The roan was fine, irritable but fine, and the creek was clear. He filled both water pots and brought in a full load of wood before he came back inside. Tessa was up. She'd moved from the bedroll to the chair at the table, wrapped in the buffalo robe, and she had the hearthstone loose. He stopped in the doorway. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I think it's time," she said. He came inside and set the wood in the water, shed his coat, and sat down on the floor across the hearth from where she was working at the loose board. She got it free on the third try, a flat timber section that had been mortared along 2 edges to look fixed, but wasn't, and beneath it was the cavity her father had made, not large, maybe 12 inches square and 8 deep, but dry, completely dry. The stonework of the hearth kept the moisture out. She lifted the tin out with both hands and set it on the floor between them. It was a sealed biscuit tin, the lid crimped down with a careful, even pressure that spoke of someone who had taken time over it. She worked the lid loose and set it aside. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in a second layer of canvas, were the documents. She unwrapped them the way you unwrap something you've been protecting for months, careful, unhurried, like the care itself is part of honoring what's inside. Federal survey ledgers, 3 of them, bound in cloth covers and filled with her father's precise, small handwriting. Boundary notations, bearing marks, chain measurements, the dense technical language of a man who spent his life recording exactly where one thing ended and another began. She set them aside. Beneath the ledgers were the receipts. Not formal documents, her father had been careful about that, careful not to make them look like something easily dismissed as forgeries. These were originals, written communications, a few in Baird's hand and a few in his agent's hands, some with partial amounts, written and crossed out and rewritten. Offer letters that had been declined and then saved. Records of meetings. A detailed log in her father's handwriting, dated entries going back to 1882, recording every contact, every pressure, every threat. And at the bottom of the tin, one more item. A hand-drawn map overlay, done in her father's drafting hand, showing the federal survey line and Baird's claimed line side by side, with the 60-foot discrepancy marked in red ink and annotated with the ledger page references. 60 feet. Reuben looked at it for a long time. He picked up the overlay carefully and held it near the firelight and looked at the 2 lines, the true line and the false one, and the distance between them. 3 years of timber operation, he said. At least 3, she said. Possibly 4. The logging started. Before my father could pin down the year, they moved the boundary markers, and the bribery receipts proved the county assessor was bought, and the land office deputy, and the original circuit judge who certified Baird's property claim in '84. She looked at the papers. My father said those were the most important ones. Without the corrupt certification, Baird couldn't have taxed us off the land in the first place. Reuben set the overlay down. He looked at the collection of papers, spread between them on the cabin floor, firelight moving over them, and he felt the full weight of what her father had built, not a fortune, not a legacy of land or money, but a case. Meticulous, careful, damning. He built this for years, Reuben said. He started the log. The day they first approached him, Tessa said. He told me he didn't know if he'd ever be believed. A Métis surveyor against a railroad baron in a county Baird, essentially owned. She looked at the papers. He said, evidence doesn't care who carries it. It's either sufficient or it isn't. It's sufficient, Reuben said. More than. She started carefully rewrapping the documents. He helped, holding the oilcloth taut while she folded it over the ledgers, and the work required them to be close in the small space, both kneeling on the floor over the tin. He was careful with it. She was practiced. "There's a federal circuit judge," Reuben said, while they worked. "Glenn, Horace Glenn. I served under a man who knew him out of Denver. He's not Baird's." She looked up. "How sure are you?" "Glenn hasn't lived in this county, and he doesn't owe Baird anything. Federal appointment. He comes through on circuit in the spring." He looked at her. "If we can get these to Glenn, the county corruption doesn't matter. The certification gets thrown out. The boundary lines go back to your father's original survey." She held that for a moment. He could see her working through it, not hoping, exactly, but calculating. Taking a real thing apart to see if it would hold weight. "Spring is 3 months," she said. 3 months, he agreed. "Baird won't wait 3 months. No," he said. "He won't." They sealed the tin together, and she put it back in the cavity, and he helped her fit the hearthstone back into place. When it was down, she pressed on it with both hands, testing it, and it was solid. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. "My father picked that spot because he said the hearth is the one place in a house that holds things," she said. "Heat, memory, the things that matter." She looked at it. He was a man who believed in the right place for things. Reuben looked at the hearthstone. He thought about a man who spent his life drawing the true lines of the land and was killed, probably, for refusing to move them, who built a fireplace hiding place and wrote a letter to a former scout and trusted that somewhere in the machinery of a corrupt system there were still a few people who would do the right thing when the right thing cost them something. He thought about what that kind of faith costs a person to maintain. "He was right to send for you," Tessa said. She wasn't looking at him when she said it. She was looking at the hearthstone, but she said it. Reuben got to his feet and went to the window and looked out at the brilliant white world outside. "We hold the claim," he said. "We keep the documents safe. We get through to spring, and we get them to Glenn." He turned and looked at her. "That's the plan." She looked back at him from the floor, wrapped in the buffalo robe, her dark eyes clear for the first time since he'd arrived. The fever was gone, and the exhaustion was still present, but underneath it, something else had come up. Something that had been buried under 4 weeks of alone, and sick and afraid, though she'd never have called it afraid, and he wouldn't either. Purpose. Her father's daughter, after all. 3 months is a long time to hold a mountain, she said. "I've held worse ground for longer," he said. She got to her feet slowly, the buffalo robe around her shoulders, and she moved to the window beside him and looked out at the snow. Side by side, a foot of distance between them, both looking out at the same white and blue and impossible silence. "Then we hold it," she said. Outside, the mountain was brilliant and cold and completely indifferent, the way mountains are. But inside the cabin, the fire was burning steady, and the documents were safe in the stone, and 2 people who had each been alone for a long time stood at the window and looked out at the same ground. It was a start. Winter settled in hard after the storm. Not the dramatic, violent hard of the blizzard, but the grinding, daily hard of deep cold that just sits on the land and refuses to move. Mornings on Black Ridge ran 20 below before the sun cleared the eastern face. The creek froze solid in the shallows and ran dark and sluggish under ice in the deep channel. The sky was clear most days, that high-altitude blue that looks almost warm until you step outside and it takes your breath clean away. They built a routine, not by discussing it or agreeing to it. Formally, it just happened the way practical things happen between practical people sharing a small space. Reuben rose first before dawn and rebuilt the fire from coals and brought in the first load of wood and broke the ice on the creek bucket. By the time Tessa woke, the cabin was warm enough to exist in without a coat. She cooked in the mornings while he did the exterior work, checking the lean-to, monitoring the snow load on the roof, managing the roan, scouting the perimeter of the claim in a wide morning loop that served partly as exercise and partly as early warning. She handled the interior in the afternoons while he split wood or worked on repairs to the cabin structure, which needed them badly and continuously. They worked well together. Not effortlessly, there was friction sometimes, two strong-willed people in close quarters, with a weight of circumstances pressing down on both of them. But the friction was the productive kind, the kind that comes from people who both care about getting things right. The porch was the first major project. One side of it had partially collapsed under the storm's snow load, the roof section dropping at a 45-degree angle against the wall of the cabin and taking two of the support posts with it. Left as it was, the remaining section would go in the next heavy snow, and the cabin's front wall would take stress damage it couldn't afford. He got it on the second day after the blizzard, when the temperature had climbed enough to work outside without losing fingers. Tessa came out to help without being asked. She was still not at full strength. The fever had taken something that needed time to come back. But she was steady on her feet, and she knew how to work. She held timbers while he notched and fitted them, passed tools, read the level of the new support posts by eye, and told him twice when he was off, and was right both times. Her father had taken her on survey work since she was 12. She'd been reading levels and angles and load distributions since before most girls her age were finished with school. The girls her age who got to go to school anyway. He didn't comment on her competence. He just used it, which was the more meaningful response. By mid-afternoon, they had the collapsed section down, the debris cleared, and the two new posts set and braced. The porch roof was framed back level. Tomorrow he'd board it and add the roof poles. She handed him the mallet when he needed it, and her bare hands were red with cold, despite the gloves. He noticed and didn't make a fuss about it. Just came inside when the structural work was done instead of pushing on to the boarding. "Tomorrow," he said, knocking snow off his boots at the door. She came in behind him and went straight to the fire without argument. That was the first day. The second day, they boarded the porch roof. The third, they worked on the floorboards inside, starting at the far end from the hearth, pulling up the boards that had heaved over the winter freeze-thaw cycle, and relaying them properly with new wooden wedges to keep them tight. It was hard, slow work. The floor was old hardwood over a packed earth base, and some of the boards had warp past saving and needed replacement from the stack of rough-cut lumber in the lean-to leftover from some previous owner's optimistic construction project. He cut them to length outside, and she fitted them in, working on her knees with the hammer, driving the wooden pegs with a precision that said she'd done similar work before. My father always said, a level floor was a sign of whether a man intended to stay, she said on the third afternoon, driving a peg home with 3 clean strikes. He said, anyone can throw up walls and a roof. The floor is different. The floor is where you live. Smart man, Reuben said. He was, she said. He was also stubborn past the point of sense on certain subjects, which is probably where I get it. He was on the far side of the room fitting a board into the gap near the east wall, and he glanced over at her. She was working with her hair tied back, wearing her father's old canvas jacket over her layered shirts, driving pegs into old hardwood with the focused, efficient energy of someone who doesn't waste motion. She'd said the word stubborn without apology, like a fact about terrain. This is what the land here is. That's what I am. He looked back at his board. It's a useful quality. Up here, they worked their way toward the hearth. The boards in the last section, the 4 feet immediately surrounding the fireplace, were in the worst shape. The heat cycling had expanded and contracted them for years, and 2 were cracked through, and 1 had partially separated from its neighbor, leaving a gap wide enough to lose a coin in. He pulled the cracked ones first, setting them aside, and started on the one beside the fireplace's left support stone. It was harder to move than the others. He worked the pry bar under the edge and put some weight into it, and the board came up with a groan of old wood and a puff of the fine gray dust that accumulates under cabin floors over decades. He set it aside and stopped. He looked down at the subfloor. Then he crouched lower, put his hand on the packed earth, and felt the edge of something. An edge that wasn't natural. The earth underneath the old board had been disturbed and repacked not recently, but within the last few years, and there was a seam in it, a rectangular outline about 16 inches by 10, fitted so carefully that you'd only see it if you were looking at the floor from 6 inches away in the right light. He looked at it for a long moment. Tessa. She looked up from the peg she was setting. Come here. She came over and looked at where he was crouched. She looked at the seam in the packed earth. She looked at him. That's not my father's hiding place, she said. His is in the hearth? I know, he said. This is something else. He got the pry bar tip into the seam and worked carefully, not wanting to break whatever was underneath. The packed earth lifted in a single piece, a fitted clay slab about an inch thick, and beneath it was a cavity. Not as well made as the hearth cavity, rougher, older. The work of someone doing it fast rather than carefully, but dry, or mostly dry. Inside was a tin, larger than Tessa's father's. Flat, rectangular, the kind that had once held tobacco or hardtack. No lid crimping, just a flat pressed seal that had held through the years, mostly because the slab above it had kept the moisture out. He worked the lid off. The papers inside were old, older than her father's documents. The edges brown and brittle, the ink faded to that particular reddish brown that black ink goes to after 15 or 20 years. He handled them with care, holding them to the light from the window. Tessa crouched beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off her. And she looked at the papers and then at his face as he read. His face changed. It was slight. Reuben Cross didn't have an expressive face under the best circumstances, but something moved through it. His jaw set. His eyes went still, in the way they went still when he was working through something that had weight to it. He set one page down and picked up the next. What is it? She asked. He didn't answer right away. He read to the end of the second page, and then set it down and sat back on his heels and looked at the far wall of the cabin for a moment. Not at her, not at anything in the room particularly. Just out, at some middle distance. These are Federal Boundary Survey records, he said, from 1880. Original commission, predating your father's survey by a year. He looked at the pages. They map the full eastern slope of Black Ridge, all 212 acres, and the adjacent 500. She looked at the pages. I didn't know my father had these. He didn't put them here. He looked at her now. These aren't his handwriting. She looked more closely at the top page, at the cramped, hurried writing at the margins. No, she said slowly. No, that's not his. These are the original commission records, he said. Before your father's survey, they established the federal line in 1880. He paused looking at the pages, and underneath these, he lifted the survey sheets carefully and set them aside. These are something else entirely. The papers beneath were different. Not survey records, correspondence letters, internal memos, written in a more formal hand on better paper that had still browned with age. He read through them slowly, and the more he read, the more his jaw set, the more the stillness behind his eyes became something harder. Tessa watched him read. When he finished, he put the papers down on the floor between them and looked at her. Do you know the name? Harlan Voss, she thought. He was the federal land administrator for this district in the early 1880s, she said. He died or left the position. I'm not certain, around 1883. He didn't leave the position, Reuben said. He was removed. There was a federal audit. He looked at the papers. These letters are between Voss and Baird. They go back to 1879. Baird was planning this before your father ever set foot on this mountain. He paused. Voss was paid to delay the original federal commission and then to alter the commission records before they were filed. The boundary line was moved in the paperwork before the first stake was ever driven. He looked at her. Your father's survey in 1881 was accurate. He drew the true line, but the altered federal records he was given as reference already had the false line embedded in them. He was surveying against corrupted baseline data, and he didn't know it. Tessa was very still, which means the fraud goes deeper than anyone knew, he said. Baird didn't just bribe a county assessor. He bought his way into federal records before the survey was even commissioned. The corruption started in 1879, and it's been running for 9 years. She looked at the papers on the floor between them. The fire ticked. Somewhere outside, a snow load shifted off the roof and fell with a soft concussion into the drift below. My father, she said carefully. He didn't know about these. He couldn't have. He found the later corruption, the bribery of the county assessor, the false certification. He documented what he could see. He didn't know the original federal records had been tampered with. He looked at her, and neither did anyone else. These have been under this floor in this cabin since, he checked the dates on the letters, since 1883 at the latest. Who put them here? Best I can read it. Someone who knew Voss. Someone who had access to Baird's correspondence with him and took copies before Voss was removed. He looked at the page edges. Someone who put them here and either died before they could use them or ran before they could use them. He paused. This cabin's had 4 owners in 6 years. She looked at him. He looked at her. The weight of it moved between them, the particular weight of information that changes the shape of everything you thought you understood. Then the other thing moved in behind it. He saw it arrive in his own thinking, the way you sometimes see something coming toward you from a distance, slowly, and then all at once. He recognized it with the sick clarity of a man who has been living with something he didn't fully face. Tessa, he said, I need to tell you something. She looked at him. The 3rd Cavalry, he said. 9th Regiment, my old unit. He looked at the floor, at the papers. In the winter of 1883, we were deployed to this district on federal eviction orders. 4 properties on the eastern slope. The orders said the boundaries had been federally certified, and the occupants were trespassing on private timberland. The room was very quiet. We removed 4 families from this slope, he said. January of 83. Snow was worse than this week. We rode them off and posted the land for Baird's timber operation. He paused. We followed orders from orders that were built on the altered federal records. We didn't know the boundary certification was fraudulent. We didn't know Voss had been bought. He looked at her. But we rode out those families in January. And 2 of the men in one of those families didn't make it to spring. She was looking at him steadily. I've been carrying that, he said, for 5 years. I left the cavalry the following summer. I told myself we'd followed legitimate orders, legitimate federal authority, and I couldn't have known. He looked at the papers, and that's true, but true doesn't fix what happened to those people. Tessa was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. A coal settled. She said, You came when my father's letter reached you. Yes, you bought this claim. You brought yourself up here. She looked at the papers, at the hidden tin, at the cavity in the floor. And you've just found the documents that prove the orders you were given were built on fraud. Yes. She was quiet again. Thinking, he let her think. The men who gave those orders, she finally said, Baird, Voss, the administrators who processed the falsified records and sent a cavalry regiment out to do their dirty work. She looked at him. They gave you a lie and dressed it in authority and sent you out to act on it. That's not a soldier's crime. That's their crime. I still rode out those families, under false orders, with no means to know otherwise. She paused. My father spent 8 years documenting corruption before he could prove it. You had 1 winter's deployment and a set of orders that came down through the full authority of the federal government. She looked at him directly. A man is responsible for what he knows and what he chooses when he knows it, not for what he was deliberately kept from knowing. He looked at her. You walked away from the cavalry, she said. You came here when you were called, and you just pulled those papers out of the floor. She held his gaze. That is who you are, Reuben. Not the man on the horse in 1883. He held the look for a moment. Then he looked at the papers, and the tin, and the hearthstone, and the floor they'd been repairing board by board, across 3 days of cold work and careful fitting. He said, I should have questioned the orders. Yes, she said, and you know it. And you've known it for 5 years, and that knowledge is what brought you here. She paused. That's what conscience does. It makes you move toward the damage, not away from it. He was quiet for a while. Outside, the winter held everything in its cold grip, indifferent and immovable. Inside, the fire gave what it had. He picked up the papers carefully and began organizing them, the original Federal Commission records first, then the Vosbaird correspondence, then the survey, overlays. His hands were steady. His face was composed, the way it was always composed. But underneath the composure, something had shifted. Not released, it was too heavy to simply release, but named, acknowledged, brought into the same room as everything else. Combined with your father's documents, he said after a while, back in the practical register, this goes all the way to federal fraud, not just county corruption. Federal. He looked at her. Glenn isn't the only judge we need. We need the federal marshal's office. Can you reach them? From Bitter Creek, if I can get in and out without Baird's men seeing me. There's a telegraph at the railroad office, he thought. Give me a week to work out the approach. We need to know who in Bitter Creek is actually Baird's before we start moving. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were on the documents, and he watched her look at them the way a person looks at something they've been reaching toward for a long time without being sure they'd ever touch it. My father always said the land remembers, she said, even when the records are altered, even when the stakes are moved. The land knows where it begins and where it ends. She looked at the hearthstone on the left side, her father's tin safe in the stone. Then at the cavity in the floor, the older documents that a dead man or a frightened one had hidden under the boards and left for whoever came next. He put everything in the right place, she said quietly. He just didn't know this cabin had 2 hiding places. Reuben looked at the floor, at the stone, at the careful repairs they'd been making board by board, working toward the hearth without knowing what the hearth sat over. Sometimes the ground holds more than you know, he said. He began carefully rewrapping the documents, both sets, together now the old Voss papers and her father's ledgers in the same oilcloth. He placed them back in the hearth cavity alongside her father's tin. Both sets of evidence in the same place, safer together than apart, the same way most things are safer together. He fitted the hearthstone back into position and pressed it level. Tessa watched him smooth the edge of it, flush with the surrounding stone. Reuben, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for telling me about 1883. She paused. You didn't have to. Yes, I did, he said. You deserve to know who's on your mountain. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she picked up her hammer from the floor and went back to the floorboards, back to the work of driving pegs into old hardwood, with clean, precise strikes. He watched her for a second, then picked up his own tools and went back to fitting the last boards near the east wall. They worked the rest of the afternoon in a silence that was different from the silence before. It had more in it, more weight, more understanding, more of the particular ease that comes between 2 people who've put the truth on the table and found out they can both stand to be in the room with it. The floor came together, clean and level, board to board, peg by peg, from the east wall all the way to the hearth. Her father was right about floors. The floor is where you live. 3 weeks passed without incident, and that was the problem. Reuben knew it, the way an old scout knows when a trail has gone too quiet. Not because anything was wrong exactly, but because nothing was wrong at all. And in his experience, that was its own kind of signal. Baird wasn't a patient man by reputation. He was a man who moved on timelines he controlled, and the county deed transfer had disrupted his timeline. And disrupted men don't sit still for 3 weeks. They were planning something. He made 2 trips into Bitter Creek during those weeks, both times riding in before dawn and leaving before noon. He kept his head down, asked no direct questions, listened in the feed store and the hardware, and once in the back room of the saloon where men who worked Baird's timber operation drank on their half-days. He pieced together what he could. Baird had brought in new men. Not local outside men, the kind that come in on the train without luggage and leave the same way when the work is done. 3 of them had been seen at the Grand Imperial Hotel. Another 2 were staying at a boarding house on the south edge of town. None of them had said what they were there for, which told Reuben everything. He came back from the second trip and told Tessa directly, without softening it. She listened with her hands folded on the table and her eyes level and her chin steady. She asked 2 questions. How many and how long did he think they had? He said 5 that he knew of, and he didn't know, but probably not long. She nodded once, got up, and went to inventory the ammunition. That was Tessa. She'd spent the 3 weeks building her own kind of strength back, not just physical. Though that too, the fever's damage slowly reversing itself with food and warmth and sleep. She'd been studying the cabin's defenses with the systematic eye her father had given her. She knew every gap in the log walls. She knew where the light hit at what angles and what time of day. She knew the sight lines from the tree line to the south and east, which were the most likely approaches, and she knew the terrain behind the cabin, the shelf of rock, the drainage gully, the slope up to the mine access point that she'd told Reuben about on the 4th day, casually, like it was just geography. He had listened to that like it was much more than geography. The mine was an old silver prospect from the 1870s, abandoned when the silver played out inside of 2 seasons. The main shaft was caved, but the ventilation system, the secondary shaft, and the connecting tunnel that ran beneath the cabin's east floorboards was intact. Narrow, low, navigable if you weren't too large, and you didn't mind the dark. He'd gone down into it twice since she'd told him. Check the ceiling supports. Check the floor. Trace the full run of the tunnel from the access point under the east floorboards to where it opened in the box canyon behind the North Ridge face. It was tight but solid. Old timber bracing still sound. He'd come back up and told her it was good, and she'd looked at him with the particular expression she had when she knew she'd been right about something and was choosing not to say so. He'd reinforced the access hatch with a new frame and a fitted cover that looked like solid floorboard from above. Tessa had done the finish work on it, planing the edges flush and treating the wood so it matched the surrounding boards. Even knowing it was there, he had to look carefully to find it. They didn't talk about it much after that. You don't talk about an exit strategy. You just know where it is. January turned into February and the cold deepened, and then, on the 15th day of the month, on a clear night with a moon so full and bright, it threw shadows across the snow. Reuben woke up from a dead sleep at 2 in the morning and lay still in the dark and listened. Nothing. He lay there for another 10 seconds. Then he got up. Quietly, no lamp, moving in the dark of the cabin with the ease of a man who had memorized every inch of his space. He pulled on his boots and his coat. He picked up the rifle. He went to the south window and looked through the gap at the edge of the oilskin. The moonlight on the snow was nearly as bright as dusk. He could see the tree line 100 yards out, the dark mass of the pines against the white meadow. He could see the trail coming in from the west, the packed snow of it, catching the moonlight differently than the surrounding drifts. He stood and watched for 2 full minutes. There, movement at the tree line. Slow, deliberate, spread wide, not one person, multiple. He counted the separations between dark shapes. 4, no, 5, moving out of the trees in a loose line, staying low, angling toward the cabin from the southwest where the shadow of the outcropping made a natural approach corridor. He crossed to the bunk and put his hand on Tessa's shoulder. She woke up the way she always woke up instantly. No transition, eyes open and present. "They're here," he said. 5 I can see, maybe more. She sat up and reached for her boots without a word. He was already at the rifle locker, the rough pine cabinet he'd built against the east wall in the second week. He opened it and laid out what they had. His repeating rifle, a Winchester Model 1000, 873, 30 rounds. Her 12-gauge, both barrels. 24 shells in the leather pouch on the hook. His Colt revolver on his hip, 6 loaded. Spare powder and shot on the shelf. Tessa came to the cabinet, fully dressed and boots on, and looked at the inventory with the same eyes she used on everything practical, reading, calculating. She took the shotgun and the shell pouch. She pulled a chair to the window on the south wall and positioned it to the left of the frame, away from the direct line of fire if someone shot through the glass. And she sat down in it and broke the shotgun and checked both barrels and snapped it closed. Reuben positioned himself at the east window. It had a wooden shutter with 3 firing slots, cut horizontally. He'd cut those himself in the first week, telling Tessa they were for ventilation. She'd looked at them and said nothing, because she understood exactly what they were for. He put his eye to the lower slot. The 5 shapes had come about 30 yards across the meadow. They'd stopped, which meant they were looking at the dark cabin and deciding something. He watched them and waited. Then one of them moved differently, an arm raised, something in the hand. Torch. Torches, he said. They're not here to talk. They never were, she said from the south window. The first torch ignited, orange against, then a second, then a third. He could see the men better now, backlit by their own fire. Heavy coats, rifles on 3 of them, and one of the figures toward the back was holding something that wasn't a rifle. A can. He watched the man lift it and understood what he was looking at. Kerosene. They're going to burn it, he said. The documents? She said. Yes. He had one moment of clarity. The kind that precedes violence, when you've been in violence before, and you know what it asks of you. He thought about the options. Surrender the documents, no. Ride out through the front 5 armed men in open snow under moonlight. The tunnel possible, but not until they had no other choice, because once they went down, they went without the documents, unless they could reach the hearthstone first. Not yet. They had walls, and they had ammunition, and they had the high ground of a defended structure. Make them work for it. Left loophole for me. Right for you, he said. Don't fire until I do. Make it count. I know how to shoot, she said. I know you do. The men were 50 yards out now, spreading wider, 2 of them moving toward the left flank, where the old collapsed section of porch had been repaired. Smart. They'd studied the cabin's layout, or someone had described it to them. Reuben waited until the closest man was 40 yards out and moving fast. He fired. The Winchester cracked in the closed space of the cabin like a cannon, and the muzzle flash lit the east wall and the snow outside the window in a white burst. The closest man went down. Reuben worked the lever, moved his aim, fired again at the torch carrier. Missed the man, but hit the torch, knocked it spinning into the snow where it fizzled and went dark. The other 4 scattered. Returns came immediately, rifle fire from the left flank. 2 shots that punched through the log wall above the east window and threw chips of timber across the room. He moved back from the slot, dropped low, came up at the next slot. Tessa fired. The shotgun was loud enough to feel in the chest, both barrels, and one of the men who'd been moving toward the south wall went sideways and down. She cracked the breech, ejected, reloaded with the speed of someone who'd practiced it, and was back at the window before the smoke cleared. 2 down, she said. Perfectly level. 3 more. The kerosene man still up. More fire from outside. Heavier now, the remaining men pouring rounds into the cabin walls. The log construction stopped most of it. 12-inch pine absorbs a rifle round from most angles. But the windows were the problem, and they knew it. Glass shattered on the north side, where there was no shutter, and cold air and moonlight poured in. Reuben moved fast to the north wall and pressed flat against it. Looked through the broken window frame at an angle. One man, circling wide to the north, using the shadow of the outcropping as cover. He waited. The man moved out of the shadow for 3 steps, crossing the open ground. Reuben fired twice, and the man went down and stayed down. 2 left. Then a heavy concussion. At the front of the cabin, something thrown, hitting the door hard, and a smell came in through every gap and crack simultaneously. Sharp industrial. Kerosene. They've soaked the door, Tessa said. I see it. He moved back to the east window and looked. The kerosene man was 20 yards out, torch in hand now, running. He fired, and caught the man at the edge of the shoulder, spun him, but didn't drop him. The torch flew from the man's hand and landed in the snow, smoking. Then, light erupted at the front of the cabin. Not the gradual grow of fire, the immediate, total ignition of kerosene catching a flame. The front room filled with orange light through every gap at the door's edge, and the heat was instantaneous and real. The door was burning. The outer planks of the front wall were burning. Smoke came through the frame gap in a rolling, oily gray wave. Reuben, he heard it, but he was already moving toward the hearth. He got to the hearthstone and got the edge of it up with his fingers, pulled the sealed tin and the oilcloth-wrapped documents out and pressed them against his chest. He looked at Tessa. She was at the south window. One man still up. He's at the tree line. She looked at him. He has the door. The door. He looked at the barred door, and he could see the orange glow at its base now, the fire licking through the bottom gap, and the bar across it was the only thing keeping the man outside from coming through. An axe would handle the bar. 2 or 3 good blows. As if answering the thought, the sound came. Metal on wood, rhythmic and hard. Axe blows on the burning door. He crossed the room in 4 steps and shoved the heavy table against the door, adding its weight to the bar. It bought seconds, not minutes. The smoke was thicker now, low and acrid, and the front room ceiling was darkening with it. Tessa was beside him. She'd taken the shell pouch and her shotgun and her father's satchel from the hook by the bunk. She was looking at him with clear eyes in a smoke-filling room, waiting. He looked at the hearthstone, now loose documents in his arms. The fire was in the front wall. The door was going. The ceiling at the front was beginning to catch at the rafters. The shaft, he said. She was already moving to the east floorboards. He went after her, one arm wrapped around the documents, the rifle in his other hand. She had the hatch cover off in seconds, the fitted board coming up and away, and below it was the dark opening of the mine shaft. Cold air breathing up from the tunnel. A shot came through the south window. Close, splintering the window frame. He dropped to a knee, raised the rifle one-handed, fired twice toward the muzzle flash outside. Tessa was dropping down into the shaft feet first, her hands on the edge, controlled. The front door gave, not all at once. The bar cracked first, one end tearing free from the bracket, and then the door burst inward with the weight of a man behind it, and fire came in with it. The burning outer planks swinging wide, orange and roaring, and the front of the cabin went from burning to fully engulfed in the time it takes to draw a breath. Heat like a wall. Reuben dropped the documents down through the shaft opening ahead of him. He heard Tessa's voice from below low, certain I've got them. He put his legs into the opening, rifle across his arms, and went through feet first. The cold of the tunnel hit him like water. Above him, through the hatch opening, he could see the orange ceiling of the cabin, the fire spreading across the rafters with the terrible speed of dry wood and kerosene. He reached up and pulled the hatch cover down from below, fitting it back into its frame. Not a perfect seal, but enough to cut the draft, enough to hide the opening from anyone standing in a burning room, looking for where the 2 people had gone. He pressed his back against the tunnel wall and waited. Above, muffled through timber and earth, the sound of the fire, the creak and crack of structural wood going, a heavy collapse the front roof section probably, coming down into the front room. Then a man's voice, shouting above it, angry, disoriented. Reuben kept still. He was aware suddenly of the blood. His left shoulder, he hadn't felt it happen, which is how it goes sometimes. The body, too, engaged to process damage while the damage is occurring. But in the cold and quiet of the tunnel, the pain arrived properly. Now, a deep, hot throb that ran from his shoulder blade to his collarbone. He reached his right hand to it. His fingers came back, dark and wet. Reuben. Tessa's voice, low from 3 feet down the tunnel in the dark. I'm here, he said. Are you hit? He thought about lying. It lasted about 1 second. Shoulder, he said. Left side. Silence from her for a moment. Then the sound of her, moving closer in the narrow tunnel. The rustle of her coat on the packed earth floor. He couldn't see her. The tunnel was completely dark. No light from the hatch, no light from ahead. He heard her hand find the wall, find his arm, move up until she located the shoulder, and he felt her fingers stop at the wet of the wound. Through the coat, she said. Can you move the arm? He moved it slowly. Pain made his vision white at the edges, but the arm worked. Yes, he said. Then it didn't break the bone, she said. We need to move. The tunnel goes 300 yards to the canyon. Can you make 300 yards? He could make 300 yards. He'd made longer in worse conditions with worse injuries, but he didn't say that because it wasn't the point. The point was moving. Go, he said. I'm behind you. Above them, the burning cabin groaned and shifted on its foundation, and somewhere in the heart of it, a timber gave way with a crack like a rifle shot, and the floor shuddered beneath them. Tessa moved forward in the dark, and he followed her, one hand on the tunnel wall for navigation, one arm tucked against his chest, keeping pressure on the shoulder, moving through the cold underground dark, away from the fire and the men and the burning wreckage of the first safe place he'd bought for $1 on a cold January morning. He thought about the hearthstone, loose and empty now. He thought about the documents in Tessa's arms. He thought about the floor they'd laid together, board by board, peg by peg, all the way to the hearth. He kept moving. Above them, through rock and earth and packed tunnel ceiling, the cabin on Black Ridge burned against the winter sky, and in the light of it, the last man standing at the tree line watched it go and thought the job was done. He was wrong about that. The tunnel ran 300 yards and felt like 3 miles, not because of the distance. Because of the dark, the cold, the low ceiling that forced them into a half-crouch, and the sound of Reuben's breathing behind her, which Tessa was tracking the way you track a fire in a dry season constantly, carefully, alert to any change in it. She moved by feel, one hand on the left wall of the tunnel, the documents pressed to her chest with the other arm, the shotgun slung across her back by its leather strap, and banging occasionally against the low ceiling, in a way that set her teeth on edge, but there was nothing to do about it. The floor of the tunnel was packed earth, with a layer of fine stone dust on top, cold enough to feel through her boot soles. The air was still and mineral-smelling, the particular underground smell of rock that hasn't seen weather in a long time. Behind her, Reuben was moving. That was what mattered. She could hear him, the deliberate pace of it, the controlled breathing of a man managing pain without letting it manage him. She'd felt the wound before they started. Enough to know it was a bullet still in there, lodged somewhere in the thick muscle of the shoulder, and enough to know it was bleeding steadily, but not catastrophically. The cold of the tunnel was actually helping with that. Cold slows blood. She knew enough to be grateful for it and to keep moving. Twice she felt the tunnel ceiling drop, and she stopped and warned him, and heard him adjust behind her, pulling down lower without complaint. Once her foot went through a soft patch of floor, a small collapse, old the timber below it long since rotted, and she caught herself on the wall and stepped around it, and told him where it was, and heard him step around it too. No wasted words, no panic. Just the two of them, moving through the dark, with everything they'd managed to save, pressed between them. The cold got different about 2/3 of the way through. Fresh cold, not the sealed underground cold of the first part of the tunnel. Moving air, very faint, carrying the smell of pine and night and open sky. She turned toward it the way an animal turns toward water, purely instinctive. And the tunnel curved right, and the ceiling rose, And then she saw the opening, a rough oval framed in old timber, maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. And through it the blue dark of a winter night, and stars, and the box canyon walls, rising pale on both sides. She went through first and straightened up outside, and breathed full air, deep and cold and real. She turned and reached back into the opening, and Reuben came through behind her, straightening slowly, his right hand going immediately to his left shoulder and pressing there. His face in the starlight was drawn tight but composed. His coat was dark and wet, on the left side from the collar, down past the shoulder blade. She looked at him, and he looked at her. "How bad?" she said. "Manageable," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting until we're somewhere warm enough to look at it properly." She looked at the canyon. The box canyon was sheltered walls of granite, on 3 sides rising 40 feet, a narrow entrance to the south that the wind hit obliquely rather than directly. The floor was snow-covered but protected. The old-growth pines along the base of the east wall were heavy with snow, their lower branches nearly touching the ground, creating a series of natural shelters where the ground underneath was dry-ish and relatively wind-sheltered. She'd been in this canyon once, with her father, 8 years ago, during a survey run. She remembered it because he'd pointed out the stone dugout. "There's a trapper's structure," she said. "East wall, about 60 yards. My father knew about it. He said it was pre-territorial, maybe 40 years old. Still standing? He thought so. The granite over it keeps the snow load off." She looked at his shoulder. "Can you make 60 yards? Tessa." "Right," she said. She went first, breaking a path through the knee-deep snow on the canyon floor, and he followed. The starlight was enough to navigate, by the snow reflected it well, and the canyon walls were distinct against the sky. She found the east wall and moved along it northward, looking. The pine branches swept low and heavy, and she had to push through them and shake snow loose, and it fell down her collar and the back of her neck, which she ignored because there were other priorities. She found the dugout where her father had said it would be. It was built into a natural recess in the granite wall, the original stone face forming the back, and one side, the rest constructed from large, flat stones, stacked and mortared with clay. Whoever had built it knew what they were doing. The roof was stone slab, not timber, which was why it had lasted 40 years without collapsing. It was low, barely 5 feet at the peak. A single room, maybe 8 feet square, with a front wall that had a door frame and no door and a small chimney niche built into the left corner. Inside, dirt floor dry. A rusted ironwood stove, small, broken at one leg but otherwise intact, sitting on a flat hearthstone. Against the back wall, a rough timber shelf, dust and old leaves in the corners, and the particular smell of a closed stone space, cold and mineral and old, and stacked against the right wall, half a cord of split wood, very dry. Some of it cracked along the grain from the years, but wood, burnable wood. She turned and looked at Reuben, who had come in behind her and was standing in the doorway, taking the measure of the space. "Somebody's been using it," he said. "That wood's been stacked, not thrown." "Trappers still work this drainage sometimes," she said. "They don't advertise it." She was already at the stove, checking the chimney niche with her fingers, feeling upward for obstructions. Clear. She found her striker in her coat pocket. She always kept it in her coat pocket, the same way her father had, because you keep fire-making on your person, or you're a fool, and she went to work on the stove with a fistful of dry leaves from the floor corners and 2 of the smallest split pieces from the stack. The fire caught on the second strike. She built it small and hot, the right way, the way her father had taught. Her small and hot is better than large and smoky in an enclosed space. Better for warmth and better for not advertising your position with a chimney column visible for miles. The stove's broken leg made it sit at a slight angle, but the flue drew properly, and the heat started coming up through the top plate inside of 3 minutes. While she worked on the fire, Reuben set the documents on the timber shelf and took off his coat. She heard his breath catch as he worked the left sleeve down over the shoulder, and she kept her eyes on the fire because he'd manage it without her watching him struggle with it. Watching a proud man fight his coat sleeve doesn't help either of them. When she turned around, he had the coat off and had gotten his shirt down over the shoulder on the left side, and she could see the wound properly for the first time. It was in the posterior shoulder, below and medial to the shoulder joint deep muscle, which explained why he could still move the arm. The entry point was clean, which meant it was a good caliber round, and it had come in straight rather than tumbling. The bleeding had slowed significantly, the cold and the pressure of the coat having done their work. But she could see the slight bulge beneath the skin, about 2 inches from the entry that said the bullet was still in there, sitting in the muscle belly. She looked at it steadily, thinking through what she needed, what she had. "Your kit," she said. "Where is it?" "Left saddlebag." A pause. "Which is in the burning lean-to." She looked at him. "I know," he said. She took inventory of what she had on her person, which wasn't much, but wasn't nothing. Her father's satchel, she opened it, on the shelf beside the documents. Inside, the things she'd grabbed in the days when she still had hope of leaving the mountains safely. A folded cloth, clean, for wrapping. A small vial of sulfur powder she'd taken from her father's medical supplies before they'd been depleted. A folding knife. The striker she'd already used, and in the bottom of the satchel, wrapped in leather, a flask. Her father's. He'd kept it for medicinal purposes only, which she'd always understood was also his way of saying he kept it for cold nights, but the distinction hadn't seemed worth arguing. She held up the flask. "Whiskey," she said. "That'll do," he said. She looked at the stove, at the small blade of her folding knife, at the flask. She looked at the wound. She looked at him, she said, against the back wall. "You'll want something solid behind you." He sat, his back against the cold granite of the rear wall, his legs stretched out, the injured shoulder facing her and the firelight. He was pale under the cold and the blood loss, but his eyes were clear, and he wasn't shaking, which meant his core temperature was still workable, and his body hadn't started pulling back from the extremities yet. She set the knife blade in the gap at the top of the stove against the hot iron and let it heat. She opened the flask. "Drink some of this," she said, handing it to him. He drank. 2 long pulls. No performance about it. He handed it back. She soaked the folded cloth in whiskey and cleaned around the wound site. Careful, thorough. He didn't move. She checked the angle of the bullet, pressed lightly around the bulge with her fingertips to map it. Shallow, maybe 1.5 inches of tissue between the skin and the base of the slug. Deeper than a graze, not deep enough to be inaccessible. She checked the knife blade. Hot enough. "This is going to be bad," she said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise. I've had worse," he said. "That's not what I said." A pause. "I know." She worked quickly because in field surgery the way to be kind is to be fast. She made the incision along the existing wound track. The body had already done half the work of opening a path, and she heard his breath go sharp, but his shoulder didn't move. She used the cloth to clear the field, felt the tip of the blade find the slug, used the knife edge to work under the base of it. It came out on the second attempt. She heard it hit the hearthstone when she dropped it, a small, flat sound. She pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth hard against the wound immediately, holding pressure, and counted to 60 in her head. Then she checked it. The bleeding was significant but controlled. She packed the cloth in tight and held it. Reuben let out a long, slow breath. His head went back against the granite wall. His eyes stayed open. "Done," she said. "Yeah," he said, "I noticed." She bound the wound with the remaining cloth, tying it across the shoulder and under the arm in a figure that would hold pressure without cutting circulation. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady through all of it, which she noted with a distant, clinical appreciation because she'd been afraid they wouldn't be. When she was finished, she sat back and looked at him. He looked at her. The fire in the small stove was warm now, genuinely warm. the stone walls holding the heat and reflecting it back, and the room was at a temperature that was survivable and moving toward comfortable. His color was better than it had been. The binding was holding. He looked down at the shoulder and then back at her. "Good work," he said. "Don't move it for at least a day," she said, "and drink more of that." She set the flask beside him. He took it and drank and looked at the fire. Outside, the canyon was silent. No sound of pursuit. No voices carrying on the cold air. Whoever had been at the cabin thought the job was finished. They weren't wrong about the cabin. They were wrong about everything else. The fire burned. The stove ticked as the iron expanded with the heat. Reuben looked at the shelf where the documents sat in their oilcloth, untouched, the tin beside them, all of it carried out through the dark tunnel, and across the snow, and into this stone room, without losing a single page. He looked at the binding on his shoulder. He looked at Tessa, who had sat down against the side wall, with her knees pulled up and her coat wrapped around her, watching the stove. He said her name. Just that, her name. And she looked at him. "The cavalry deployment in 1883, he said. "The 4 families." He stopped, built the next part carefully. One of them was a man named Duchesne, Pierre Duchesne. He had a wife and 2 young sons. We rode them off the southeast corner of this claim on a Tuesday in January, snow knee-deep. He looked at the stove. He made it to Bitter Creek with his family. But the younger boy was sick from the exposure and died in March. The fire ticked. "There was a woman on the second property," he continued. "Older, alone, a widow. She told me to my face that we were doing the devil's work and she'd report us to the federal marshal." The sergeant laughed. "I didn't." He paused. "I should have done more than not laugh. I should have put her name in my report. I should have asked who drew the boundary line we were enforcing and on whose authority. Instead, I finished the deployment and rode back to the fort and filed a clean report and didn't think about it hard enough until I'd left the cavalry and the thinking had nowhere to go but inward." Tessa was watching him. "I've been carrying those 4 families," he said, "every day for 5 years. That woman's face when she called it devil's work. Duchesne's boy." He looked at his hands. "I told myself I didn't know," which was true. And I told myself there was nothing I could have done differently with the information I had, which was probably true, and neither of those things made it lighter to carry. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. The stove gave its heat. The stone room held the warmth and them inside it. Then she moved. She shifted across the small floor to sit beside him, close, her back against the same granite wall, and she looked at him the way you look at someone you're about to tell a hard truth to directly, without the softness that's really just distance wearing a kind face. "Reuben," she said. He looked at her. "The men who gave the orders bear the sin," she said. "Not the soldier who woke up and walked away." She paused, bared. "Voss, the men in the land office who filed the false certification. They built that machine, and they pointed it, and they pressed you into service without your knowledge or consent." She held his gaze. "You were a weapon they used. That's different from being the hand that chose. I was the hand that rode," he said. "Under a federal order built on falsified federal records," she said. "How does a cavalry scout in January of 1883 disp a federal certification? You'd have had to know the baseline records had been altered. You'd have had to know Voss was bought. You'd have had to know things that were hidden in a sealed tin under a floorboard in a mountain cabin." She paused. "You didn't know because they made sure you didn't know. That's the nature of that crime." He said nothing. "You took a bullet for me tonight," she said, "standing between me and a burning door." She let that sit for a moment. "That is who you are, right there. That is the answer to what you've been asking yourself for 5 years." The fire popped. He looked at the stove, and then at the wall, and then, finally, at her. She was close. Close enough that the firelight moved across her face clearly, and he could see everything in it. The directness, the certainty, the complete absence of mercy saying or performance. She believed what she'd said. It wasn't comfort for its own sake. He'd known enough comfort for its own sake to recognize the difference. He let out a long breath. Not a release, it was too big to release in one breath, but something in it acknowledged. Something that had been standing rigid in him for 5 years, sat down and leaned against the wall alongside him. Dushine's family, he said. When this is done, when Glenn has the documents and the land is restored, I want to find them. Yes, she said. Simply. No qualification. They're owed more than a land deed. Yes, she said again. We'll find them. The word we sat between them in the warm stone room, without any fuss or ceremony, just there, natural, the way certain words land when they're true. He looked at the documents on the shelf. Glenn's circuit comes through in April, he said. Maybe 10 weeks. 10 weeks? We can't go back to the cabin. He looked at the stove, but this is workable for now. The canyon's sheltered. The structure is sound. There's wood. He thought through it. I need to get to Bitter Creek. The telegraph. We need to reach the federal marshal's office before Baird's men report back to him, and he starts moving to cover his tracks. You can't ride with that shoulder, she said. I can ride with this shoulder. Not tonight, you can't. He looked at her. She looked back, and there was no give in it. Not stubbornness exactly, but the simple, unbendable fact of medical reality delivered by a person who just had her hand inside his shoulder muscle and had no interest in doing it twice. Tomorrow, she said. If the wound holds through the night and the bleeding doesn't start again. Tomorrow, he thought about arguing. He thought about the timeline, about Baird, about 10 weeks to Glenn's circuit. He thought about the federal marshal's office in Denver and the telegraph in Bitter Creek and the need for speed. He thought about the fact that a man who reopens a field-dressed shoulder wound in a winter canyon dies of blood loss and exposure 3 days later and doesn't make it to any telegraph. Tomorrow, he said. She nodded once. She didn't make a thing of winning the argument. She got up and added 2 pieces of wood to the stove and set the flask within his reach and went to the shelf and checked that documents habit by now. The checking. The reassurance that they were still there and still intact. They were. She sat back down against her section of wall, coat around her, and they were quiet for a while in the fire-lit stone room that smelled of old rock and new smoke and whiskey. Outside, the February night was deep and cold, and somewhere behind them, the cabin on Black Ridge was ash and timbers, and in Bitter Creek a man named Baird was going to wake up in the morning thinking he had won. He thinks we're dead, Tessa said. Probably. Or he'll think we ran. Either way, he thinks we're gone, Reuben said. And the documents with us. She looked at the shelf. He's wrong. She pulled her coat tighter and looked at the stove. My father used to say that the ground is more patient than the men who fight over it. The ground just waits. She paused. He meant it about surveys, about the way the true boundary is always there, even when the records say otherwise. You go back and measure, and it's exactly where it was. He wasn't wrong. No, she said. He rarely was. A pause. I miss him. The fire burned. He didn't fill the silence with anything because there's nothing to put in that particular silence that doesn't make it smaller. He just let it be there with her. After a while, her breathing slowed and evened, and he looked over, and she'd fallen asleep against the wall. Her head dropped to one side, her coat still wrapped around her, the fatigue of the tunnel and the surgery and everything that had come before it finally collecting its due. He kept watch. The stove needed feeding every 40 minutes or so, and he managed it with his right arm, moving carefully, keeping the left side still as she'd told him. The wound was a steady throb, but it wasn't opening. The cold had done its work, and the binding was holding. Outside, the canyon was silent and still. No wind, no sound. He sat in the warmth and the dark and thought about 10 weeks, and the telegraph, and Glenn, and the documents on the shelf, and a family named Duchesne somewhere to the north, and the true boundary line drawn by a dead man's careful hand. He thought about the word we. He kept watch until dawn. The wound held through the night. Reuben knew it had held because he was still conscious at dawn, and the binding was still dry at its outer layer, and his left arm still worked when he tested it, carefully, against the wall. Pain, yes, sharp and real, when he moved past a certain range. But controlled pain, the kind you can work with, the kind that tells you what's happening rather than just screaming. He'd kept the fire through the night, feeding the small stove every 40 minutes with quiet precision, moving only his right arm, keeping his back against the wall and his eyes on the stone doorway where the dark had slowly grayed into the pale, flat light of a winter dawn. Tessa woke at first light, the way she always woke. Instantly, completely, with no soft border between sleep and presence. She looked at him. He looked at her. The check passed without words. She scanned him the way she'd been scanning him since the tunnel, reading color and posture and the quality of his breathing, and whatever she saw apparently satisfied her, because she got up and went straight to the stove and started managing the fire. "You kept it going," she said. "That's what fires need." She looked at him over her shoulder, and it was the same thing he'd said to her in the cabin on the second day of the blizzard, and she recognized it, and a small line appeared at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. She added wood. She checked his binding without asking permission, lifting the edge of the outer cloth with careful fingers, looking at the field dressing beneath. She pressed lightly around the wound site with her fingertips, reading it. He watched her face. "Still closed," she said. "Good." She sat back. "You need to eat something." "I know, and you're not riding to Bitter Creek today." He looked at her. She looked back. The same unbendable medical fact, same delivery. "Tomorrow," she said. "If it's still closed tomorrow and the fever stays off, you can ride tomorrow." He thought about arguing. He looked at her hands, the bruised wrists, nearly healed now, the capable, steady hands that had extracted a rifle slug from his shoulder in a fire-lit stone room at 2 in the morning without flinching, and he thought better of it. "Tomorrow," he said. She went through the satchel and found what little food remained. 2 strips of dried meat she'd grabbed from the cabin supplies in the last moments before the fire. A handful of hard corn kernels from a cloth pouch her father had always kept in the satchel bottom, for reasons she'd never fully understood, but she understood them now. She put the corn kernels in the flask cap with a little water from the snow melt she'd set on the stovetop, and she let them soften while they ate the dried meat in small pieces. It wasn't enough. They both knew it wasn't enough. "There's game in the canyon," he said. "Rabbit runs along the east wall. I saw the tracks coming in last night. You were losing blood last night. I still saw the tracks." She looked at him. "I'll set snares this morning. I've done it before." She paused. "My father taught me." Of course he did. This time the line at the corner of her mouth made it all the way to a smile, brief and real, and then it was gone, and she was back to the business of the corn kernels. They were quiet for a while. The stove gave it steady heat. The stone walls held it. Outside the canyon was white and blue, and still the old-growth pines carrying their loads of snow like patient old men. The granite walls, catching the early light and throwing it back cold and clean. He looked at the documents on the shelf. Oilcloth and tin, everything intact. "Tell me about Glenn," she said. "Federal Circuit Judge, appointed out of Denver, 1881. He was a territorial judge before that, Montana, during the worst of the range wars." He paused, choosing what was relevant. He shut down 2 land grab operations in Montana, personally rode out with federal marshals, not county sheriffs, and he specifically went around the compromised local courts. He understands how Baird's system works because he's dismantled versions of it before. She was watching him carefully, the way she watched things that mattered. "The evidence we have," he said. "The original Federal Commission records, the Voss correspondence, your father's ledgers and boundary overlays, the bribery receipts. Glenn doesn't need a confession. He doesn't need a cooperative witness. What we have is sufficient to void the original land certification, which collapses Baird's entire legal claim to the eastern slope. And the criminal charges? The Voss correspondence, establishes federal fraud. That's not county jurisdiction, it's federal. Glenn can refer it to the federal marshal's office independently of anything the county courts do or don't do. He looked at her. Baird's been operating in county courts his whole career because that's where he has purchase. Federal is different ground. She was quiet, turning it over. He'll fight it, she said, even with the evidence. Men like Baird always fight. They have lawyers and money and time. He met her eyes. But they can't fight a federal boundary restoration. The land either belonged to him or it didn't, and we can prove it didn't. The rest, the timber revenues, the criminal charges, those take longer. But the land comes back first. She looked at the shelf. My father believed that, she said, that the land was the thing. Get the land, right, and the rest follows. He was right. She nodded slowly. Then we get to Glenn. That afternoon, she went out and set 4 snares along the east wall where the rabbit runs were, using thin wire from a coil she'd found on the timber shelf left by a trapper, part of the same cache that had left the wood stacked against the wall. She was gone 40 minutes and came back cold but satisfied, and she reported the snow conditions, the visibility from the canyon entrance, and the fact that she'd seen no tracks other than animal ones crossing the open meadow to the south. Nobody was looking for them here, or nobody had found them yet. The afternoon passed in the small stone room. He slept for 2 hours in the early afternoon, his body taking what it needed, whether he invited it or not, and woke to find the fire still burning. And Tessa sitting cross-legged on the floor, with her father's survey ledgers open on her knee, reading through them slowly, tracing the boundary notations with one finger. She wasn't copying anything, just reading. Like reading her father's handwriting was a way of hearing his voice. He watched her for a moment without announcing he was awake. She turned a page. Her face in the afternoon light was composed and intent, the particular expression of someone fully present in what they're doing, and he thought about how different that was from the fever-wrecked woman at the shotgun 2 weeks ago. Not that she'd been diminished then. She hadn't been. But this was different. This was her in full, and the full of it was considerable. He moved and she heard it and looked up. How's the shoulder, she said. Better, don't lie. Better than last night, he amended. Which is accurate. She put the ledger back on the shelf, with the same care she always used handling her father's things, and she checked his binding again and changed the inner dressing using the last of the clean cloth from the satchel. The wound looked cleaner than she'd expected. No heat to the surrounding tissue, no swelling beyond what was normal. The edges trying to pull together, already the way clean wounds do. You heal fast, she said. Always have. A pause. My mother used to say it was my one useful quality. She looked at him. She was wrong about the one. He said nothing, but the set of his jaw shifted slightly, and she went back to tying off the new binding. The first rabbit was in a snare by evening. She retrieved it and cleaned it with a brisk efficiency that confirmed she'd done it many times. And she cooked it over the stove in the flask cap and the flat of the hearthstone with a patience that coaxed more flavor from a small rabbit than seemed strictly fair. They ate it all, and she divided it evenly, and he didn't argue about his share, even though she'd given him the larger portion. That night, the temperature dropped hard. He'd been watching the signs all afternoon, the quality of the light, the way the shadows ran, the slight shift in the wind direction that came through the canyon entrance at dusk. He knew what was coming before it arrived. So did she, he thought. They'd both been reading mountain weather long enough to feel it coming in the joints before the sky confirmed it. By full dark, the stone room was cold, in a way the stove was struggling to address. The stove was small, and the fuel was finite, and the stone walls, which were excellent at holding warmth in a sustained situation, needed sustained warmth to hold. The temperature outside was dropping into the territory where exposed skin goes wrong in minutes. The cold came through the gap of the open doorway. There was no door, just the frame in a steady pressing weight. He added wood to the stove. Watched the temperature in the room. Added more. The wood stack was going faster than he'd calculated. At this rate, they'd be out by midnight, and there was no more in the canyon that he knew of, and no safe way to go looking for it in these temperatures at night. Tessa was watching the stove with the same calculation. "The shelf," she said. "The timber shelf. The boards are old and dry. That's furniture. It's firewood," she said. "We don't need a shelf." He looked at it. She was right. He worked the boards loose one-handed, his right arm doing the work, and fed them into the stove in pieces. It bought an hour. The temperature in the room climbed back to workable and held there. But an hour was an hour, not a night. He did the arithmetic straightforwardly. The cold was going to win the arithmetic. He looked at her. Him, two adults in a stone room, with a finite fuel supply and a temperature outside that was going to kill them both if they let the core go. This was not a complicated problem. It was a survival problem, and survival problems have survival solutions. And anyone who has spent real time in real wilderness understands that the body's warmth is the most reliable heat source available when every other source runs out. "The furs," he said. He had his bedroll, a heavy wool blanket, rolled and brought from the cabin. In the saddlebag, Tessa had grabbed. At the last moment, she'd snatched it from the hook by the door as the front room ignited. A decision made in 2 seconds that had turned out to matter. She had her coat and the buffalo robe still with them, carried out through the tunnel. "Together," she said. "Not a question. Best chance to hold heat," he said. "Both of us, everything we have." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The conversation they weren't having was about trust and about the specific vulnerability of shared warmth in a cold room, and they both understood it, and neither of them needed to dress it up or complicate it, because they'd been sleeping 10 feet apart in a one-room cabin for 2 weeks, and the distance between 10 feet and 2 feet was not the kind of distance that required ceremony to cross. "Your shoulder," she said. "Right side down," he said. "I can manage it." She nodded once. She lay down first, arranging the bedroll and the buffalo robe over the both of them. The coats underneath, for ground insulation against the cold stone floor. He lay down beside her, right side down as he'd said, his left shoulder up, and she pulled the full arrangement over them and tucked the edges under, and the combined warmth was immediate and real. They lay still. The stove ticked. The cold pressed at the walls and found the gaps and came in at the edges. But inside the furs, the warmth was building. 2 bodies in close proximity doing what bodies do in cold, which is give everything they have. He was aware of her. Profoundly, completely aware. The way you're aware of a fire in a dark room. Not analytically, but entirely. The warmth of her along his right side. Her breathing, which was steady and controlled. Her hand, which had settled near his, not touching, the inch between them, carrying its own particular weight. Outside the canyon, the cold worked the land without mercy or preference, the way cold does. Inside the stone room, the stove ticked down toward its last. When the last piece of shelf timber burned, and the stove went to coals, and then to warmth, and then to cold iron, the furs held what they'd built. It was enough. Barely enough. The way things are barely enough on a mountain in February, but enough. He didn't know exactly when the shift happened. These things don't have a precise moment. There's the before, and there's the after. And between them is something that builds so gradually and so inevitably that by the time you're fully in it, you've already been in it for a while. He was aware of her turning toward him in the dark, the warmth of her face near his shoulder. The steady sound of her breathing close. He turned toward her. He could not see her in the dark of the room, the stove long cold, no moon through the doorway. But he could feel her, the warmth she'd built. Her hand, which had found his at some point in the hours of the night, and was there, real and present, he said. Her name? She said his. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not the kind of thing that announces itself with ceremony. It was the kind of thing that happens between 2 people who have been through fire together, literal fire, in their case, and have come out the other side with everything stripped back to what's real and what matters. And what's real is this, and what matters is this. And the cold outside, and the dark inside, and the 300 yards of tunnel they'd come through to get here made a kind of sense of it that no amount of ordinary circumstance could. He touched her face in the dark with his right hand. Her hand came up and covered his. He could feel the healed ridges of the bruises on her wrists under his fingers, and he felt the tenderness move through him toward them, not pity, nothing like pity, but the specific reverence of a man who understands what something cost and holds it accordingly. She pressed into his hand. There is a particular quality to intimacy that happens inside survival. It's not desperation, and it's not recklessness. It's the opposite. It's clarity. When everything unnecessary has been removed, when cold and fire and fear have burned away all the social scaffolding, what's left is what's actually true. And what was actually true in that stone room was that these two people had chosen each other, deliberately and repeatedly, from the first moment she'd put the shotgun down to the last moment he'd stood between her and a burning door. And the body understands these choices even when the mind hasn't finished cataloging them. He moved his arm, and she settled against him, and the cold had nothing to say about any of it. She touched the scar at his collarbone, the old one from the territorial years, and traced it without asking what it was from. She wasn't asking for history right now. He wasn't offering it. What was here, and here was enough. Her breath was warm against his shoulder. His right hand moved through her hair, and she arched into it, and the sound she made was quiet and real and entirely hers. He touched her scars, the wrist bruising. The old, thin scar on her collarbone, she'd told him, was from a fall on a survey trip at 14. The places on her that carried the record of all the things that had tried to diminish her and hadn't. He touched each one with absolute reverence, the way you touch something you understand the value of. She pulled him closer. The cold was outside, and they were inside, and the stone walls held them, and whatever they built between them in the dark was theirs, belonging to nobody else, owed to nobody, the private property of two people who had come to this mountain separately and would leave it together. In the deep, cold hours of the night, Tessa gripped his scarred shoulders and arched into his embrace in total trust and shared passion, and she gasped it against the cold air. The same words she'd said the first night, in the doorway with the fever and the shotgun dropping, but different now, carrying everything that had happened between then and here. You finally came. He understood exactly what she meant. Not the dollar and the deed and the trek up the mountain, not even the bullet he'd taken. She meant the rest of it, the man who'd sat by the door without presumption, who'd covered her with the buffalo robe and meant what he said about bloodlines, who'd told her the truth about 1,883, taken her response like medicine and let it work. She meant the man who had come to her, finally, fully, without the armor. He held her in the dark, and the cold pressed at the walls and couldn't get in. They slept eventually, tangled and warm, the furs around both of them holding the heat of two bodies that had decided, without any particular announcement, to put their survival in each other's hands. He woke before dawn, as he always did. She was still asleep against him, her breathing slow and even her dark hair across his good shoulder. His left shoulder ached with a clean, manageable throb. The room was cold, but not dangerous cold. They'd held enough warmth through the night to keep the floor temperature survivable. He lay still and didn't move. Outside the canyon, the sky was going from black to deep blue at the edges, the very first suggestion of dawn pressing in through the open doorway. He could hear the wind, light and distant, moving through the upper pines. He could see two stars still bright enough to be visible in the doorway rectangle, and he watched them fade as the light came up. Tessa stirred. Didn't wake, just shifted slightly, her hand finding his arm and settling there. He thought about what came next, the telegraph to Denver, the ride into Bitter Creek, which he would make today, shoulder or not. They were out of wood and low on food, and the situation required movement. Glenn's circuit in April. The documents on the floor where he'd moved them last night, the oilcloth and the tin, all of it intact. Duchesne's family, somewhere north, owed a reckoning that money couldn't fully cover, but he'd try anyway. The cabin on Black Ridge, which was ash now, but the land under it was still the land, and the land still had a deed with his name on it and a boundary line that a man named Mercier had drawn true. He thought about all of it, and it was a lot, and he didn't mind it. When Tessa woke, she came awake in the usual way, instant and present, and she was still for a moment oriented, and then she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything particular about what the night had been. There was nothing to explain or justify or account for. It was simply what was true. They both knew what was true, and they both knew what came next, and the space between those two knowings was occupied entirely by the present moment, which was the two of them in a stone room, in a canyon, in February, with the dawn coming in through the doorway and 10 weeks of hard work ahead of them. Shoulder, she said. Manageable, he said. She checked it anyway. Fingers at the binding, gentle and thorough. She looked at what she saw and nodded once, which was as much approval as she generally offered. You can ride today, she said. I know. You'll go to the telegraph first, before anything else. Yes, and you'll be careful going in, she said. Not careful like a man who thinks he's bulletproof. Actually careful. He looked at her. I thought I was paying you for the surgery, not the instructions. You haven't paid me anything. I bought the mountain, he said, the line at the corner of her mouth. Real, this time held a little longer than before. You did, she said. I suppose that counts for something. She started breaking down the camp, the few things they had to break down, and he got up and went to the canyon entrance and looked out at the morning. The snow was still and white, and the sky was clearing, clouds moving off to the east, the kind of morning that follows a hard, cold night with a clean, calm brightness. He stood there for a moment in the doorway. Two victims, some people might have called them, a displaced woman and a disillusioned soldier, on a burned claim in a canyon in February, with nothing but a tin of documents and each other, and a plan that depended on a federal judge they hadn't contacted yet. He looked at the canyon, the granite walls and the old-growth pines and the clean snow and the morning. He didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a man who knew what he was standing on, and where it ended and where it began. And he felt like a man who had someone standing alongside him who knew the same things and had paid more to know them. He went back inside to get ready to ride. 8 weeks. That was how long it took to move from a cold stone dugout in a canyon box to the front steps of the Grand Imperial Hotel in Bitter Creek, with the evidence that could bring down Montgomery Baird's empire. 8 weeks was not a long time in the abstract. In the specific, in the daily reality, of two people operating in hostile territory with limited resources, a healing shoulder wound, and a man with hired guns actively looking for confirmation that they were dead. 8 weeks was considerable. Reuben made the first telegraph contact on the morning. He rode down from the canyon, his left arm in a rough sling Tessa had fashioned from a strip of canvas. He went into Bitter Creek before dawn and left before the town fully woke, slipping in and out through the back end of the rail yard, where the telegraph office's second line for freight coordinations, and the operator on duty. Before 6 in the morning was a young man named Cord, who was neither Baird's man nor particularly interested in who sent what to Denver. The message he sent was 8 words. Evidence secured. Federal fraud. Request circuit contact. Cross. The name at the end was for the former commanding officer in Denver who knew Glenn, who knew Reuben, and who would understand what those 8 words meant and what to do with them. The reply came 3 days later through Cord, who passed it to Martha Cole at the back alley clinic on the south end of town, because by then Reuben had identified Martha Cole as one of the few people in Bitter Creek who operated completely outside Baird's economy. Martha Cole was in her late 40s, wide-shouldered and calm, a woman who ran a medical clinic in a room behind her house, using supplies she purchased from her own earnings, and without any blessing from the town's official medical establishment, which was controlled by a doctor who answered to Baird. She'd been stitching up miners and treating the wives of timber workers and delivering babies in that back room for 6 years. She'd been doing it under Baird's implicit disapproval for 6 years, which meant she'd been demonstrating every single day that some things matter more than who controls the money. Reuben had found her through a miner's wife who'd mentioned her name twice in different conversations in the feed store, always in a tone of quiet, specific gratitude. That tone is useful information. He'd visited the clinic on the second trip down from the canyon and told her the truth, which was both a risk and a calculation. Martha Cole would either help them or she wouldn't, and there was no middle option available. She'd listened to everything he said, asked 4 precise questions, and then said she'd pass messages and watch Baird's movements, and she'd been doing exactly that since. The reply from Denver said Glenn's circuit was being accelerated. Federal Irregularity Review. Officially. He would arrive in Bitter Creek in the first week of April. That was 5 weeks away from the telegraph message. 3 weeks from the morning. Reuben read the reply at Martha's kitchen table. 3 weeks to hold their position and prepare. They spent those weeks in the canyon dugout and in a second location, an abandoned prospector's camp 2 miles east that Tessa had known about from her father's survey notes. Higher and more defensible than the canyon, with a clear sightline down both approach trails. They moved between the two, never staying in one place more than 3 consecutive nights. Reuben's shoulder healed. The wound closed clean, no infection. The deep muscle knitting back together with the same stubborn efficiency that had always characterized his body's response to damage. Tessa set snares, and he hunted when he could. Mar sent food packages up through a miner named Asa, a broad, quiet man who worked one of the independent claims on the North Slope and whose opinion of Baird would have required a longer vocabulary than he generally used. He brought supplies 3 times and asked nothing in return except whether they needed anything specific. And when they said, "Not yet," he nodded and went back down the mountain. They weren't alone on this mountain. They were learning that. The mountain had people on it who'd been absorbing Baird's pressure for years and were tired of absorbing it. Baird, for his part, seemed to believe they were gone. Martha reported that his hired men had left town on the train 9 days after the fire. The story in Bitter Creek was that the Black Reg cabin had burned accidentally a chimney fire, an empty cabin. Unfortunate, but unremarkable. Nobody official had investigated. Nobody official had been meant to. Baird had filed no report because filing a report would require acknowledging there had been people in that cabin who weren't there now, and acknowledging that would raise questions he didn't want asked. His silence was its own kind of evidence. The documents stayed wrapped in oilcloth, sealed in the tin, carried by Tessa at all times in her father's satchel. She didn't let it out of arm's reach. She slept with it. On the nights when the cold was worst, and they lay close under the furs for warmth, the satchel was between them and the wall, always within her hand's reach, the way a person keeps the most important thing always slightly closer than everything else. April came in with mud and snowmelt, and a sky that couldn't decide between winter and spring. The high peaks were still white, but the lower slopes were running with meltwater. The creek below, Black Ridge swollen and brown, the trails cut through with rivulets that hadn't existed in February. The world was thawing out, and everything that had been frozen solid was becoming complicated again. Glenn arrived on the Tuesday train. Martha sent word through Asa the evening before. The judge had sent his own advance notice to the county sheriff, a formality, a circuit judge informing local law of his arrival, but he'd sent a separate communication through the federal marshal's relay in Denver that had come to Martha's address through a chain that Baird couldn't see. Glenn knew what he was coming to. He'd had 5 weeks of preparation and the preliminary summary that Reuben's contact in Denver had put together from Reuben's telegraph messages. He was not coming to conduct a routine circuit session. Reuben and Tessa came down the mountain on the morning of the second day after Glenn's arrival. They came openly. That was the decision they'd made in the canyon. On a cold night 3 weeks earlier, talking it through the way they talked through everything directly, without softening, each of them making their argument and listening to the others. She'd said, "Come in openly," and he'd agreed, because the alternative was arriving like fugitives and being treated accordingly. They had the evidence. They had the right. Skulking into the back of a courtroom, with their hats down, was the posture of people who weren't sure of their ground. They were sure of their ground. They rode down the main trail in broad morning light, side by side, Reuben on the blue roan and Tessa on the small bay mare that Asa had brought up 2 weeks ago, without explanation beyond a shrug when Reuben asked about it. Both horses were steady and well-rested. Both riders were clean as two people can get, who've been living on a mountain for 2 months, Tessa's dark hair braided and pinned, her best wool dress under her father's canvas coat, the satchel across her body. Reuben in fresh clothes that Martha had sent up, his coat brushed, his beard trimmed to a clean line, his rifle in the scabbard, and the colt on his hip. They looked like people who belonged here. Because they did. They reached the main street of Bitter Creek at 9 in the morning, which was when the town was awake, and moving miners coming off night shift, shop owners opening up, the feed store already busy. People looked. People always look at 2 riders coming in together with that particular quality of deliberate calm that says they have something specific in mind. Reuben looked straight ahead. Tessa looked straight ahead. He was aware of the double looks. She drew the quick assessment, the adjustment, the specific quality of a small western town's attention when someone who doesn't fit the expected category rides through the center of it. He didn't look at the people who looked at her. He kept his eyes forward and his posture even, which was its own statement. She kept her chin level. She'd been keeping her chin level her whole life. The Grand Imperial Hotel sat midway down the main street, a 2-story timber building with a new false front that was the most expensive thing on the block, and therefore the most obvious. A territorial flag hung above the door alongside the county seal. Glenn had established his court in the lobby, as circuit judges did in towns without dedicated courthouse facilities. It was common practice, legal and recognized. The traveling nature of federal justice-making, do with the best available space. They tied the horses at the rail outside. Reuben looked at her. She looked at him. "Ready," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. They walked through the door together. The hotel lobby was large by Bitter Creek standards, 20 feet across, with a plank floor and a reception desk and a sitting area that had been rearranged into a rough court configuration. Chairs brought in from the dining room formed 2 rows facing a desk at the far end, behind which sat Judge Horace Glenn. Glenn was 63, built lean and angular, with white hair cut short, and a face that had been weathered by decades of territorial service into something that resembled granite more than skin. He wore a plain black coat, no ornamentation, no robes. Federal circuit didn't require them, and Glenn had never bothered with them anyway, according to what Reuben's contact had said. He sat very straight in the chair behind the desk, reading a document, and he looked up when the door opened. His eyes found Reuben first, then Tessa, and he set the document down. The lobby had perhaps 15 people in it. Townspeople, a few miners, the hotel proprietor against the far wall looking uncertain, 2 men by the window who were county deputies. Reuben clocked them immediately, read their posture, determined they were present out of obligation rather than loyalty, and would follow whoever clearly held authority. Glenn's own man, a federal marshal's deputy named Briggs, stood at the left side of the desk with his arms folded. Big man, experienced eyes, the specific stillness of a federal officer who has been in this situation before and knows how it goes. No sign of Baird. Not yet. Reuben walked to the desk and stopped 6 feet out, which was the distance of a man presenting himself. Not demanding. "Judge Glenn," he said. Reuben Cross. We spoke through intermediaries in Denver. This is Tessa Mercier. Her father was the federal surveyor on the Black Ridge claim. Glenn looked at them both. His eyes were gray and direct, and gave nothing away that he didn't intend to give. Mr. Cross, he said. Miss Mercier. He paused. I've been expecting you. Please sit down. There were 2 chairs at the front of the assembled rows facing the desk. Reuben pulled the left one slightly out for Tessa, not as ceremony, just because it was the natural thing, and she sat, and he sat beside her, and Tessa opened the satchel and placed the sealed tin on the desk in front of Glenn. Then she placed the oilcloth-wrapped documents beside it. Federal Original Survey Commission records, 1,880, she said. Her voice was clear and steady, reaching the whole room without effort. Correspondence between Montgomery Baird and Federal Land Administrator Harlan Voss, dated 1,879 through 1,882. My father's survey ledgers for the Black Ridge claim, 1,881, with boundary overlay, mapping the discrepancy between the false registered line and the true federal line. She paused. Receipts and written records of bribery, documenting payments to the county land assessor, the county recorder, and the circuit judge who certified Baird's 1,884 property claim. The lobby was completely silent. Glenn had not moved. He looked at the documents and then at Tessa, and his expression was the expression of a man who has seen many things over many years, and does not often encounter something that genuinely adds to that collection. Something in the gray eyes sharpened. How long have these been in your possession? He asked. The documents my father compiled, 8 months, she said, since his death in August of last year. The older Federal Commission records, the Voss correspondence, we discovered those in February, concealed under the floorboards of the cabin on the Black Ridge claim, which subsequently burned, Glenn said. Burned by men working for Montgomery Baird, Reuben said. In February, we went in through a mine ventilation shaft. He paused. The documents came with us. Glenn looked at him for a moment. You identified these men as working for Baird. I identified 5 hired men who arrived on the train from the east 8 days before the attack. I identified their movements and their contact with Baird's operations manager. I'm prepared to testify to that identification under oath. Glenn looked at the tin, the oilcloth, the stack of her father's ledgers. His hands moved forward, and he began, slowly and methodically, to open the seal on the tin. The room was still watching. The county deputies by the window had shifted their weight. The miners in the rows behind had leaned forward. The hotel proprietor had stopped pretending to do anything else. Then the hotel door opened. Montgomery Baird walked in. He was dressed the same as he'd been at the auction, the black cashmere coat, the silver-headed stick, the waxed mustache, and the controlled, unhurried presence of a man who has never once walked into a room and believed he was not the most powerful person in it. He had 2 men with him, both in good coats, both carrying the particular careful blankness of attorneys. He stopped when he saw Reuben. He stopped when he saw Tessa. Something moved through his face. He recovered it in a second and a half, which was fast a lesser man would have needed 5. His eyes went to the desk, to the documents Glenn was beginning to examine, and the recovery completed, and the thin, composed expression came back. He walked forward. Judge Glenn, he said pleasantly, I was informed you were in session. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, Glenn said, without looking up from the document in his hands. Baird stopped. The pleasantness stayed in place over something that was no longer pleasant. He looked at the documents on the desk, the open tin, the oilcloth, and ledgers. I see Mr. Cross is still making trouble with his dollar's worth of mountain, and the trespasser is still. Miss Mercier is a material witness and a primary claimant, Glenn said. He still hadn't looked up. You'll address her appropriately, or you won't address her. The lobby had gone even quieter. The 2 county deputies hadn't moved, but they weren't leaning on the wall anymore either. Baird looked at Glenn. He looked at the documents. He looked at Reuben, and in that look was the calculation of a man running numbers onto a situation that was shifting against him faster than he'd anticipated. He was still composed. He was still certain, or still performing certainty, and it was getting harder to tell from the outside which it was. Then the hotel door opened again. Martha Cole came in first, in her good coat, her gray hair pinned neatly. Behind her came Asa, the miner from the North Slope, and behind him, in a group that filled the doorway, and then some, more miners, 6 of them, 8. Men who worked the independent claims on the slope, men who'd been absorbing Baird's timber quotas and tax pressures and false boundary restrictions for years, men who'd watched their operations squeezed from every direction and understood why, and hadn't had anyone to say it to who could do anything about it. They came in and took their places along the back wall and in the remaining chairs with the quiet, collective deliberateness of people who have decided today is the day. Martha Cole walked to the front and stood beside Tessa's chair. She looked at Judge Glenn. "My name is Martha Cole," she said. "I've been providing medical care to the mining families of this district for 6 years. I'm prepared to provide testimony regarding the systematic extortion of timber quotas, medical supply restrictions, and intimidation of independent miners by Montgomery Baird's operations, including documented instances, across the last 3 years." She paused. "I kept records. They are available." Glenn set down the document he'd been reading and looked at the room, at Tessa, at Reuben, at Martha Cole standing straight beside the chair, at the miners along the back wall, at Baird, and his 2 attorneys standing in the middle of all of it. He picked up the next document from the stack. Baird said, "This is a performance, a coordinated." "Mr. Baird," Glenn said, "I am examining a Federal Survey Commission record dated 1880 that appears to have been materially altered before filing. I am also reading a letter signed with your name making a specific payment offer to the federal land administrator in charge of this district." He looked up. For the first time, he looked directly at Baird, and the gray eyes had nothing in them except the cold, clean certainty of a man who answers only to evidence. "I would strongly suggest you stop speaking until I am finished reading." One of the attorneys put a hand on Baird's arm. Baird looked at the hand. He looked at Glenn. He looked at the documents. The thin smile was gone. Reuben watched it go. He watched Baird look at the stack of papers on the desk, the 9 years of his operation, the falsified records, the bribery receipts, the survey overlays, the Voss correspondence, and he watched the man calculate and come up short, for the first time in what was probably a long career of never coming up short. Tessa sat straight in her chair beside Reuben. Her father's satchel was empty on her lap. Everything it had carried for 8 months now spread across a federal judge's desk in the broad light of an April morning. Her hands were folded over the empty satchel, and they were completely still. Glenn read for 11 minutes. The room was quiet enough to hear the clock on the hotel wall and the distant sound of the street outside, and nothing else. When he set the last document down, he looked at his deputy Briggs, and he said 4 words: "Take him into custody." Briggs moved. It happened fast. The way these things happen, when a federal officer has decided no performance, no announcement, just the direct physical fact of a large man, covering the distance between himself and Baird, with a purpose that wasn't going to be redirected by attorneys or silver-headed walking sticks. Baird stepped back. His hand went to his coat. "Don't," Reuben said. He said it once, clearly, from his chair, and he didn't move, and he didn't reach for the Colt. He just said it, the way you say something to a man you want to actually hear you. And Baird heard him, and Baird's hand stopped. Briggs reached him and took hold of his arm, and the 2 attorneys stepped back, and Montgomery Baird stood in the middle of the Grand Imperial Hotel lobby, with a federal deputy's hand on his arm, and 9 years of fraud on the desk behind him. Glenn looked at Reuben. "Mr. Cross, I'll want your full testimony. Today, if you're available." I'm available, Reuben, said Miss Mercier. Glenn looked at her. Your father's work was meticulous. In 20 years on the federal bench, I've seen perhaps 3 cases built with this quality of documentation. He paused. He served this process well. Tessa looked at the judge. Her voice was level and exact. He served the truth, she said. That was the only process he recognized. Glenn held her gaze for a moment, with the gray, weathered eyes of a man who has spent a career trying to make those 2 things the same. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. Martha Cole put her hand briefly on Tessa's shoulder. A quick, firm pressure, and then withdrew it. Tessa didn't look up. She was looking at the documents on the desk, her father's survey ledgers. The boundary overlays in his precise hand, the true line drawn in red ink against the false one. 60 feet, 9 years. Reuben sat beside her and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying right now. What needed doing was being done. Briggs was moving Baird toward the door with the practiced efficiency of a federal officer who has made this kind of exit before. The 2 attorneys were conferring in tight, rapid whispers. The miners along the back wall were watching with the particular expressions of men who have waited a long time to see a specific thing happen, and are now watching it happen, and are not entirely sure yet whether to believe it. Glenn began organizing the documents into a formal evidence record, calling his clerk forward with a ledger. Martha Cole sat down in an empty chair and folded her hands and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down and is taking stock of her own hands. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the main street of Bitter Creek continued its morning horses and mud, and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of a town that didn't yet fully know what had just shifted inside the Grand Imperial Hotel, but would know soon enough. Tessa reached over and put her hand over Reuben's where it rested on his knee. Just her hand on his. No pressure. Just there. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed like that, while Glenn worked through the documents, and the April light came in through the hotel windows, and everything that had been buried under hearth and floorboard and mountain stone came up into the light where it belonged. The arrest lasted about 40 minutes before Baird found his footing again. Reuben had expected that. A man like Baird doesn't get to where he is without knowing exactly what to do when the ground shifts. By noon, he'd had a private conference with his attorneys in the hotel's back parlor, and by 2 in the afternoon, there were papers being filed with the county clerk on a procedural challenge to Glenn's jurisdiction over the certification dispute. Glenn threw the challenge out in 11 minutes. Baird's attorneys filed another one. Glenn threw that one out in 4. The third filing landed on Glenn's desk at 3:30, and Glenn looked at it for about 30 seconds, set it aside, and told Briggs to keep Baird in the hotel under house supervision until the federal custody transfer could be arranged. The transfer would come from Denver in 2 days' time via the morning train. 2 days was a long time. Reuben gave his testimony that afternoon, while Tessa gave hers in a separate room to Glenn's clerk. The testimony took 3 hours on his end. Every question Glenn asked was precise and without ornamentation, the kind of questions that don't invite opinions or stories, just facts, dates, locations, names. Reuben answered the same way. He described the night of the fire, the 5 men he'd identified, the mine shaft, the documents, the ride to the telegraph. He described the 1,883 cavalry deployment without being asked, because it was relevant, and because Glenn needed to understand the full architecture of the fraud. He laid it out clean and didn't editorialize. Glenn listened to all of it, with his hands flat on the desk and his gray eyes steady. When Reuben finished, Glenn said, the 1,883 deployment. You were following orders based on falsified federal records. Yes. And you left the cavalry the following summer. Yes. For what reason, officially? Reuben looked at him. I cited personal reasons and, unofficially? A pause. I couldn't verify that what we'd done to those 4 families was legal. I couldn't prove it wasn't. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And a man who can't stop thinking about whether what he's doing is right probably shouldn't keep doing it until he figures that out. Glenn looked at him for a long moment. "That's an honest answer," he said. "It's the only kind I have," Reuben said. At 5 o'clock, Briggs came through the parlor door and told Glenn there was a problem. Baird was gone. Not escaped exactly. The house supervision arrangement had allowed him access to the hotel's back corridor, and at some point in the middle of the afternoon, while Briggs was managing the paperwork for the federal transfer, and the county deputies were doing whatever county deputies do when they've decided which way the wind is blowing, Baird had walked down the back corridor and out the service entrance. Glenn stood at the service entrance, looking into the alley for a moment, and then he looked at Briggs and he said, "Find him." Briggs nodded and went. Reuben was already pulling on his coat. He knew where Baird had gone before anyone said it. The man had one thing left to protect. Not his freedom that was already a diminishing asset. Not his reputation. His operation. 9 years of timber revenue, equipment, payroll records, every physical piece of his empire in this county. The coal processing mill. It sat on the south edge of town, half a mile from the main street. A sprawling industrial complex that Baird had built on the profit of everything he'd stolen from the eastern slope. 3 main buildings, 2 holding bins, and at the center of it, the coal breaker itself, a massive mechanical structure of iron drums and conveyor chains, and crushing rollers that processed raw coal into sellable grades. The thing ran on a steam engine the size of a small building and could be heard from anywhere in Bitter Creek when it was operating. It wasn't operating now. The mill shut at 4 on weekdays, which meant it was empty, which meant it was the right place for a man who needed to destroy records before the federal marshals arrived from Denver. Reuben went out the front of the hotel and turned south. He didn't run. Running announces you. He walked at the pace of a man with somewhere to be through the spring mud of the main street and south past the freight depot and the livery stable and the outskirts of town where the buildings thinned out and the road became a track and the track led to the mill gate. The gate was open, chain hanging loose, the padlock removed. Someone had a key. He went through. The mill complex was quiet in the late afternoon light. The steam engine was cold, no smoke from its stack, and without it running, the whole place had the particular silence of heavy machinery at rest, all that potential weight and noise, just sitting there, waiting. He moved through the outer yard between the holding bins, reading the ground. Boot tracks in the coal dust, heading toward the main breaker building. Fresh tracks. The breaker building was the largest of the 3. A 2-story timber and iron structure with loading doors on 3 sides and the conveyor system running in from the south and out the north wall. The main doors were closed. The side door on the east wall was not. He went through the side door. Inside, the breaker was an organized chaos of machinery, iron drums, and chain conveyors, and the massive crushing rollers at the center, all of it connected by a web of drive shafts and leather belts that ran from the main steam input at the south wall to every working part in the building. With the engine cold, it was all still, but the scale of it filled the building, every inch of headroom taken up by some piece of the mechanism. The smell was cold dust and machine oil and old steam. Light from the high windows came in at a low angle, late afternoon gold, cutting through the industrial dark and angled shafts full of floating dust. Baird was at the far end of the building, at a heavy iron safe mounted into the west wall beside the main control station. He had it open. He was feeding papers into a coal bucket, and he had a lamp in his other hand. He heard Reuben come in. He didn't run. He turned and looked across the length of the breaker, building 40 feet of iron machinery between them and his face in the angled light was in a way that had stopped looking like confidence and started looking like something else, something more effortful. "Mr. Cross," he said. His voice carried well in the metal space. "You're persistent. Put the papers down, Reuben said. Baird looked at the bucket. Looked at the lamp. These are internal business records, he said. My property. I have every legal right to. You're about to burn evidence in an active federal case, Reuben said. Put them down. Baird set the lamp on the control station carefully. He looked at the papers in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at the machinery around them, the massive drums, the drive shafts, the iron crush rollers, and Reuben read the look for what it was. A man taking inventory of his terrain. He moved. He was faster than he looked, which Reuben had already allowed for. He went left and behind one of the large iron drums, putting its mass between himself and Reuben, and he pulled the pistol from under his cashmere coat as he moved. He fired once. The shot rang off the iron drum, and the sound in the enclosed building was enormous. Reuben dropped behind the nearest conveyor housing, a heavy iron box that absorbed the shot comfortably, and he pulled the Colt and came up with it. But he didn't fire. Baird was moving again, deeper into the machinery, using the drive shafts and the hanging leather belts as cover, working toward the north loading doors. He was trying to get out. Reuben moved in parallel on the opposite side of the central conveyor system, tracking the sound of Baird's boots on the iron grate floor. He came around the end of the main crushing drum array and found him. Baird had made it to the north wall, but not the door. He'd misjudged the layout in the half-dark and come up against the iron catch frame below the north conveyor output, a heavy structure at chest height, and he'd stopped there with no clean way forward. And Reuben 8 feet away. He still had the pistol. Reuben had the Colt. They were very still in the coal dusty light. Put it on the frame, Reuben said. Baird's hand on the pistol was steady. His face wasn't showing panic, which was either admirable or dangerous depending on the man, and with Baird it was probably both. You're going to walk away from this, he said. Whatever Glenn does, I have lawyers and I have time, and this county will not give up what I've built here without a fight that goes on longer than you have patience for. That may be, Reuben said. You're a scout without a commission. She's a half-breed with a dead father's papers. Glenn is one judge. Baird's voice was measured, persuasive, the voice of a man who had talked his way through things his whole career. I'm offering you the same thing I offered her father. Be reasonable. Her father told you no, Reuben said. I'm telling you no. Then we have a problem. We do, Reuben said, but I'm the one who knows what to do with the problem, and you're the one standing against a catch frame. Baird looked at the Colt. He looked at Reuben's face, and whatever he was looking for there he didn't find, and he knew it. He'd built his career reading men and knowing which ones could be moved and which ones couldn't, and he was reading Reuben Cross now with the concentrated attention of a man whose life may depend on getting it right. He saw what was there. His jaw tightened, his hand dropped. He set the pistol on the top of the catch frame. Reuben moved forward and swept the pistol off the frame with his left hand, tucking it into his coat. His shoulder pulled hard at the motion, and he let it. He reached past Baird and pushed the north loading door open, letting the late afternoon light in. He took Baird by the upper arm. Firm grip, not brutal. He turned him toward the door. Baird resisted for 1 second. Just one. The old reflex of a man who has never been physically moved by anyone. And then, something about the size of Reuben's hand on his arm, or the light coming through the door, or the simple fact of what was waiting outside, settled into him. And the resistance stopped. Reuben walked him out into the mill yard. Briggs was coming through the main gate with one of the county deputies behind him. He stopped when he saw them, read the situation, and kept coming. Baird was looking at the deputy, a man who had been on his payroll for 2 years, indirectly, and who now wasn't meeting his eyes. He was looking at the mill, at the building and the holding bins, and the equipment and the 9 years of operation represented by all of it. Reuben looked at it too. Then he looked at Baird, and he said it clearly, so there was no misunderstanding about what was happening and why. I won't make a martyr out of a thief, he said. You'll stand trial, and you'll watch every acre go back to the people you stole from. Baird looked at him. Something moved through his face that wasn't composed and wasn't calculated. Something raw and old that had been underneath the cashmere and the silver-headed stick and the velvet chair for a long time. He didn't say anything. Briggs reached them and took Baird's other arm, and Reuben let go, and they walked Montgomery Baird out through the mill gate and up the road toward the Grand Imperial Hotel and the federal process that was already in motion and would not stop now. Reuben stood at the gate for a moment and watched them go. Then he turned back into the mill yard and went to the breaker building and retrieved the coal bucket with Baird's papers in it, and he carried it back to the hotel intact. Glenn was waiting. Tessa was in the lobby when he came through the door. She saw the bucket, saw his face, saw his coat where the shoulder had pulled, and there was a small dark stain at the left seam that he hadn't been aware of until he saw her look at it. "You're bleeding," she said. "A little," he said. "The shoulder. It'll close again." She looked at him for a moment with the dark eyes that didn't give much away and gave everything away simultaneously. Then she took the coal bucket from his hand and carried it to Glenn's desk. He let her take it. He thought that was probably the right instinct. Glenn looked at the bucket, looked at Reuben, and took the papers out one by one and began adding them to the evidence ledger. Briggs brought Baird through the front door and into a back room, and the hotel proprietor stood behind his desk, looking like a man who had rented out his lobby for a court session and gotten considerably more than he'd budgeted for. Martha Cole was still there, in her chair by the window, watching the evening come down over the main street of Bitter Creek. She'd been there all afternoon. She looked at Reuben when he came and sat down near her, and she said, "Shoulder?" "Minor," he said. "I'll look at it tonight," she said, not offering informing. "All right," he said. Tessa came back from the desk and sat beside him, and they watched Glenn work through the papers from the coal bucket, adding each one to the record, building the case that would go to Denver on the morning train with Briggs and Baird and 9 years of documented fraud. Outside the window, Bitter Creek was quieting into evening. Somewhere up the street a door opened, and music came out of one of the saloons briefly, and then the door closed again. The street was muddy with the spring thaw, and the light was the particular gold pink of an April evening in mountain country, the kind that makes even ordinary things look like they might matter. Reuben looked at it. He thought about Duchesne. He thought about the widow who'd called it devil's work and been right. He thought about the 40-minute ride back up the mountain when all of this was done for the day, the canyon and the stone dugout and the work that remained. He thought about the spring. Tessa put her hand in his, the same way she'd done that afternoon, and he held it, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Glenn looked up from the evidence ledger. "Mr. Cross," he said, "Miss Mercier, I'll have formal documentation of the boundary restoration ready for federal filing by end of week. The land reverts to the original survey line." He paused. "The Black Ridge claim, 212 acres, east slope, is yours," Tessa said quietly. "It was always ours." "Yes," Glenn said. "It was." He went back to the ledger. The clock on the wall kept its time, and the April light moved down the street outside, and in the back room of the Grand Imperial Hotel, Montgomery Baird sat with his attorneys, and the particular silence of a man who has run out of moves. The ground had been more patient than him. It usually is. Spring came to Black Ridge the way spring comes to high mountain country slowly, then all at once. The snow went off the south-facing slopes first. In late March, the melt running down in thin, clear sheets over the granite and gathering in the draws and cutting new channels through the meadow grass that was just beginning to show underneath. By mid-April, the lower elk meadows were green, a tentative, bright green that looked almost surprised to be there after the winter they'd had. By the end of April, the upper bench where the cabin had stood was clear of snow, the burned foundation exposed to the spring sky, the stone chimney standing alone in the ruin, like something that had decided to stay no matter what. The chimney was solid. Whoever had built it originally had known their work. Reuben looked at it for a long time the first morning they came back up. Then he looked at the bench, the spring creek, the timbered slope to the north, the granite face to the west catching the morning light. He looked at all of it, the way a man looks at the ground he's decided to keep, not as scenery, but as material, as the stuff of something. "The chimney's good," he said. Tessa stood beside him, her father's satchel across her body out of habit, empty now of everything it had carried. She looked at the chimney. "My father said when he first surveyed this bench, he thought it was the best situated piece of ground on the whole eastern slope." She paused. "He wasn't wrong about that either." "No," Reuben said, "he wasn't." They'd spent the last 3 weeks in Bitter Creek, most of it necessary. Glenn's paperwork, the federal filing, the formal boundary restoration, all of it moved at the speed of federal process, which is not fast but is thorough, and Glenn was thorough. The original survey line was restored in the federal record on April 18th. The fraudulent 1,884 certification was voided. The federal marshal's office in Denver had taken custody of the criminal case, the fraud charges, the Voss connections, the bribery documentation, and it would work its way through the federal court system over the months ahead. Baird had gone to Denver on the train under Briggs's supervision. On April 3rd, his 2 attorneys following in the next car. He hadn't looked at anyone when they walked him to the platform. He looked at the train. He looked at the rails heading east and south, and then he got on. Reuben had watched from the platform. Tessa had not come to the station. She'd said she had nothing to watch for in that direction, and she was right. The county sheriff, the real one, not the deputy who'd been on Baird's payroll, but the elected man from the north end of the county who'd been squeezed out of relevance for 3 years, had formally voided the tax foreclosure on the eastern slope claims once Glenn's boundary restoration was filed. 14 families were in the process of getting notices that their land was theirs again. Duchesne was one of them. Reuben had found Pierre Duchesne through the county recorder's office, which now had a clerk who answered to the county and not to Baird. Duchesne had settled in a small mining community 40 miles north, working a marginal claim and doing day labor to keep his family going. He had 2 boys still. The older one was 17 now. Reuben had ridden up there on a Tuesday in early April, alone. He'd been gone 2 days. He hadn't told Tessa exactly what he'd said to Duchesne when he got there. He'd told her that he'd gone, and that Duchesne would be getting his land notification, and that Reuben had left some money with him, and that the man had said very little in response, but had shaken his hand at the door when he left, a slow and deliberate handshake that communicated things that were too large for the words available. Tessa had listened to all of it. She'd put her hand on his arm briefly. That was all. She understood it didn't need more than that. Now the spring was here, and they were back on the mountain, and the burned foundation was in front of them, and there was work to do. The miners came up on a Saturday 3 weeks later. Asa came first, the way Asa always came, without announcement, appearing at the edge of the clearing in the early morning with his tools over his shoulder. He looked at the foundation, looked at Reuben, said, "Where do you want the corners?" And that was the conversation. After that, they came in 1s and 2s. 7 miners from the eastern slope claims, 3 from the north drainage, who'd gotten their land back and were looking for something specific to do with the feeling that gave them. A man named Hector, who worked the independent saw operation outside Bitter Creek and arrived with a mule loaded with rough-cut cedar lumber and the expression of someone delivering a thing they're glad to be delivering. Martha Cole came up on the second Saturday with 2 of the women from the mining family's Duchesne's wife, Elise, among them a small, weathered woman who looked at Tessa with the careful eyes of someone deciding something important, and then put out her hand and said, "My husband told me what your father's work will do for our family." I wanted to say that myself. Tessa took her hand. She held it for a moment without speaking, and then she said, "Your husband's family is what the work was for. All of it." Elise Duchesne nodded once, tight and certain, and let go of her hand, and went to see where she could be useful. The new cabin went up over 3 weekends. Cedar, as Reuben had said it would be, properly notched at the corners, the foundation built on the original stone base which was still solid under the burned debris. They cleared the ruins first, 4 hours of hard work with the burned timber, and what they found under it was the hearth, the old stone hearth, smoke-blackened but intact, the same hearthstone, the same careful masonry. The fire had done everything it could, and the hearth had simply declined to participate. They built around it. Tessa was everywhere during those weekends, holding plans that she'd drawn herself on survey paper. The kind of detailed floor plan her father had taught her to produce, the kind that told the builders exactly where every beam and board needed to go. She answered questions with the same directness she answered everything, without softening and without condescension, and by the end of the second weekend, the miners were routing their questions to her first, and Reuben second, and the arrangement seemed natural to everyone. He watched it, and thought there was something her father would have recognized in it. The woman who knew where the lines were. He built the porch himself, mostly, on the evenings after the work crews had gone back down the mountain. He took his time with it. Good cedar planking, properly fitted, covered with a roof that would shed snow correctly and not repeat the failure of the original. He built it wider than the old porch, wide enough for 2 chairs side by side with room to spare. He didn't explain why he made it that wide. He just built it that way. Tessa watched him from the doorway one evening, the spring light going orange over the ridge to the west, and she looked at the porch taking shape, and she looked at him, and she didn't say anything, but she brought him a tin cup of coffee without being asked, and that was its own kind of statement. Judge Glenn came back in the 3rd week of May. He came up the mountain in a rented buggy, which was optimistic given the state of the trail, and he arrived at the new Cedar homestead in the early afternoon on a Thursday with his clerk behind him, and a document case under his arm, and the same gray, steady eyes. He stepped out of the buggy and looked at the cabin and the cleared bench and the spring creek and the timber on the slopes, and he stood there for a moment in the May sunshine, doing what judges apparently do when confronted with a piece of land that has had its history restored to it. "Well," he said, "your father picked good ground, Miss Mercier." "I know," she said. The ceremony was on the porch. That was what Reuben had built it for, or part of what he'd built it for, the part that was for a specific afternoon, and not just for every ordinary evening going forward. Glenn conducted the ceremony the way he conducted everything, without ornament, without performance, straight and honest, and in plain language. There were perhaps 20 people on the bench in front of the porch. The miners and their families, Martha Cole in her good coat, Asa standing at the back with his arms folded, and the particular expression of a man who has strong opinions about quiet satisfaction. Hector from the saw operation, a few of the women from the mining families who had come for their own reasons and brought food, which was piled on a rough table set up in the yard in quantities that suggested everyone had understood. This was an event. Elise Duchesne was there, with her older son, the 17-year-old who stood straight and watched the proceedings with dark, serious eyes. Reuben stood on the porch in the best clothes he owned, which weren't remarkable, but were clean and well-fitted, and he looked at the people assembled in front of him, and he thought about the courthouse in January, with the stale cigar smell and the velvet chair in the front row, and a silver dollar on a pine table. 5 months. Tessa came out through the cabin door and stood beside him. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, dark blue wool, simply made, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, with a few small braids woven through it on both sides, in the Cree way her mother had taught her before she died. She wore a small piece of beadwork at her collar that had been her mother's, and she wore it openly, the way a woman wears the things that are hers. She looked at him when she came to stand beside him, and she looked exactly like herself, which was the best thing she could have looked like. Glenn opened the document case. The ceremony took 11 minutes, which seemed about right. Glenn's language was direct and federal, which was its own kind of beauty, the law saying plainly what it meant, no room for misinterpretation, a thing done right. He spoke the words that made the land theirs, jointly. Under the restored boundary survey of 1,881, the deed recorded in the Federal Land Office, under both their names. He spoke the words that made them married, which was a shorter set of words, but carried more. When Glenn finished, he closed the document case and looked at them both over it. "The land is recorded," he said. "The boundary is the true one. What you build on it is yours." He paused, and something in his gray eyes shifted slightly. The judge permitting himself a moment of something other than procedure. "Your father would be satisfied, Miss Mercier." "Mrs. Cross," Tessa said. Glenn looked at her. A small thing moved at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Cross," he said. Someone behind them started clapping, and it spread through the assembled crowd with the happy, slightly ragged quality of applause that's entirely sincere and not at all practiced. Martha Cole was smiling in a way she probably didn't show very often, wide and unguarded. Asa was still standing at the back with his arms folded, but he was nodding, and for Asa that was a celebration. Reuben looked at Tessa. She looked at him. He thought about the door in January, the cocked shotgun, the fever-bright eyes. He thought about the blizzard and the floor they'd laid together board by board toward the hearthstone. He thought about the tunnel in the dark and the stone room, and 3 words said twice, with 2 entirely different meanings, and both of them true. He thought about the man who'd knocked on a door with the specific intention of not hiding the fact that he was there. He put his hand to her face and she leaned into it, and he kissed her once, simply, and the small crowd made the noise that crowds make. And somewhere behind them in the cabin, the hearth stood solid in the stone, where it had always been. They turned and looked out from the porch together. The eastern slope of Black Ridge ran away below them in the May afternoon, green and timber, dark, and cut with the silver threads of the spring runoff. The meadows opened up, and the old growth on the north face catching the light in its high canopy and throwing it back gold green. The creek was running clear and fast below the bench. The sky above the ridge was the particular blue of high altitude in late spring, deep and clean, the kind of blue that means the winter is genuinely finished, and what comes next will be different from what came before. The boundary line was where it had always been, 60 feet east of where Baird had tried to put it. Her father's line, true and recorded and restored. The land spread out from where they stood, and it was theirs, and it was real, and it had been bought for $1, and held for 5 months against fire, and hired men and fraud, and January, cold, and all the considerable machinery of a man who had believed that enough money made him permanent. He wasn't permanent. The mountain was permanent. They were standing on it, Tessa said quietly, just for him, not looking away from the slope and the timber and the afternoon light. "My father said the land remembers." "He was right," Reuben said. She turned and looked at him, and it was the look she had when she'd made a decision complete, no qualification, the whole of her behind it. "We'll remember too," she said. He looked at her, and then he looked at the ground under their feet, the solid cedar planking of the porch he'd built wide enough for 2, and below it the bench and the cleared yard and the new cabin walls, cedar and sound, standing on the old stone foundation that the fire hadn't moved. "Yes," he said, "we will." Behind them, the gathering had moved to the food table, and the sound of it filled the bench in the May afternoon. Voices and laughter and children who'd come up the mountain with their parents and were discovering the creek with the enthusiasm specific to children and water in spring. Reuben and Tessa stood at the porch rail, shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the slope. Not running, not waiting, just standing on the ground they had fought for. In the spring light, on the mountain that had tested them and kept them and given them each other, which was more than either of them had come here looking for, and exactly what both of them had needed. The creek ran. The pines moved in the light wind coming down off the ridge. The sky stayed blue and enormous overhead, indifferent and clean, the way mountain sky always is. The boundary line held where it was supposed to hold. The ground remembered. They were home.